Victor Kane's hand came down so hard on the auction platform that the wood cracked beneath his fist. "This woman and her brats are going to the lowest bidder," he announced, and he was grinning when he said it. The kind of grin a man wears when he already knows how the story ends. "And I'll make sure nobody in this county ever hires her after." The crowd shifted. Some men looked away. Most didn't. Eliza Hartwell stood on that platform in the July heat with her daughter's hand in her left hand and her son's hand in her right, and she did not look down. She had made herself a promise that morning, kneeling in the dirt outside the jailhouse where they'd held her overnight. Whatever happened next, she would not let these people see her break. She was 31 years old. She had buried her husband 4 days ago. And now the town of Caldwell Creek, Colorado, was deciding what to do with her. If this were your mother, if this were you, what would you do? Before we go further, if stories like this one move you, if they make you feel something real, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that platform, because what happens next will change everything. The morning Eliza found out about the debts, she was still wearing her mourning dress from the funeral. Martin Hartwell had been dead less than 48 hours when the banker, a thin man named Aldous Price, arrived at her door with a leather satchel and an expression that sat somewhere between regret and impatience. He didn't take off his hat when she opened the door. That was the first sign. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I'm afraid we need to discuss your husband's accounts." She let him in because she didn't know what else to do. Clara was 7, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of bread she wasn't eating. Benjamin was 5 and had been following Eliza from room to room all morning like a small, silent shadow. The house still smelled like the flowers people had brought, lilies and something sweeter she couldn't name, and it seemed wrong to be talking about money inside that smell. Price laid the papers on the table without being asked to sit down. The number at the bottom of the first page made Eliza's vision narrow at the edges. "That can't be right," she said. "I'm afraid it is." She picked up the paper. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. "Martin didn't. He never told me. Men often don't." Price said it gently, but not kindly. There was a difference. "The loans go back 4 years. The land was collateral. The house as well." "This is my house." "It was," he said. "As of this morning, it belongs to the bank." Clara looked up from the table. She was old enough to understand tone, if not words, and the tone in the room had shifted into something cold. She reached across and put her small hand over Benjamin's, and Benjamin let her, which was how Eliza knew he was scared too. She stood there in her morning dress in a house that no longer belonged to her, holding a piece of paper that explained why, and she thought, "Martin, what did you do?" She hadn't known. That was the thing that would stay with her longest. Not the debt itself, not even the loss of the house, but the fact that her husband of 9 years had carried this alone and never once let her see it. She didn't know whether to be angry at him or to grieve him differently. As a man, she had understood less than she believed. She didn't have time to decide. Price needed the house by Friday. That gave her 3 days. She spent those 3 days doing what women on the frontier did when the ground dropped out from under them. She went to people she thought might help. The Reverend, who was kind but had nothing to give. Her neighbor Ruth Calloway, who offered a corner of her floor in genuine sorrow but whose own husband was barely keeping their farm. The women at the dry goods store, who looked at her with that particular expression she would come to know well. Sympathy layered over relief that it wasn't them. By Thursday evening, she understood something clearly. There was no one in Caldwell Creek who could take in a widow and 2 children and not suffer for it. The frontier did not run on generosity. It ran on survival, and survival was a narrow margin that most families were already right up against. She slept that last night on Ruth's floor with Clara pressed against her left side and Benjamin against her right, and she lay awake listening to the wind come off the mountains and thought about what came next. She did not have an answer when morning came. The town meeting was already posted by the time she walked into Caldwell Creek the next day with the children. She hadn't known about it until she saw the notice nailed to the post outside the general store. The paper was fresh. The ink still had a slight sheen in the morning light. "Community Settlement of Debtor Dependents," it read, and below that in smaller letters, "All unclaimed dependents of deceased debtors will be assessed for placement and labor assignment. Friday, 10 a.m., Town Square." She read it twice. Then she read the smaller print at the bottom, which she had missed the first time. "Presided over by V. Kane, Community Commerce Board." Victor Kane owned the largest saloon in Caldwell Creek, a gaming hall, and two of the three buildings on the main block that weren't owned by the bank. He also, she had heard people say, owned the sheriff in the way that powerful men sometimes owned officials, not with a paper document, but with enough past favors and future threats to make the distinction meaningless. She stood outside the general store with Clara holding her hand and Benjamin leaning against her leg, and she thought very carefully about what her options were. She counted 3. She could run, but she had no horse, no money, no destination, and 2 children who were already exhausted and hungry. Running on the frontier without resources was not escape. It was a slower kind of dying. She could fight it, but fighting required standing up in that town square in front of men who had already decided, and saying what? That she had rights? She had seen what happened to women who said that in places like Caldwell Creek. They said it, and then they stood there alone while the room went quiet in the particular way that meant nothing was going to change. Or she could go to the square, stand where they told her to stand, and keep her children in her sight every second. She chose the third. Not because it was good, because it was real. The square was already crowded by the time she arrived. Word travels in small towns the way smoke does, without permission and into every corner. Half of Caldwell Creek had come out to watch, some with the flat faces of people who've decided something isn't their business, others with the bright eyes of people who find other people's suffering briefly interesting. There were women in bonnets along the far side who wouldn't meet her eyes. There were men near the platform who looked at her, and then at the children, and then at each other. Victor Kane was already on the platform when she got there. He was not a large man physically, which sometimes surprised people who hadn't met him before. He was trim and well-dressed in the frontier way. Not the clothes of a dandy, but the clothes of a man who understood that appearance was a form of power. His boots were expensive. His hat was clean. He had a face that could arrange itself into charm or contempt with equal ease, and he was using the contempt aversion now, scanning the crowd with the expression of a man at an event he organized and therefore controlled. When he saw Eliza, something in his expression shifted. She had met him once before, briefly, at a gathering at the Callaway farm 2 winters past. He had spoken to her for perhaps 4 minutes and then moved on to speak to Martin. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Men on the frontier often did that. Addressed the husband as if the wife were part of the furniture. She had been used to it. But now, standing at the edge of the crowd with her children beside her, she felt the weight of Kane's attention land on her differently. It was not the look of a man who had forgotten her. It was the look of a man who had been waiting. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said from the platform. He didn't raise his voice much. He didn't need to. The crowd had already gone quiet. "You can come to the front." She didn't move immediately. She made herself take one breath, and then another, and then she walked forward with Clara's hand in her left and Benjamin's in her right, and her chin level, and she did not look at the faces watching her. The platform was rough pine, sun-bleached and hot underfoot, even through her boots. Kane was standing 3 feet from her, and the smell of his cologne was sharp and out of place in the morning dust. "Now," he said, turning to the crowd with an easy smile. "As most of you know, when a man dies in debt on this frontier, the question of his dependents becomes a community matter." He paused. He was good at pauses. The kind of man who understood that silence in front of a crowd creates pressure. Mrs. Hartwell's husband, God rest him, left obligations he couldn't meet. The house and land have gone to the bank, which leaves the town with a choice about what to do with his widow and children. "She could leave," someone in the back called out. "She could," Kane agreed pleasantly. "With what money? To go where?" He spread his hands as if the question were genuinely open. "No. The practical solution, the frontier solution, is placement. Mrs. Hartwell is a capable woman. Her children are old enough to be useful. There are households and businesses in this county that need labor, and there are people in this square today who are in a position to offer it." Eliza understood then what was happening. Not labor, not placement. What Kane was describing, dressed in the language of community practicality, was a sale. She looked at her daughter. Clara had gone very still, the way she sometimes did when she was frightened. Not crying, not speaking, just becoming absolutely quiet, as if making herself small enough might make her invisible. Benjamin had moved slightly behind Eliza's leg. He had one fist in the fabric of her skirt. She put her free hand on top of his fist and pressed once, gently. "I know," she was telling him. "I know." Kane's hand came down on the platform edge and the wood cracked. And that was when he made the announcement she had already halfway been expecting. Lowest bidder first, to cover the debts. And then he looked at her with that particular grin, the one that meant he already knew how this ended. And he said, "And I'll make sure nobody in this county hires her after." The crowd reacted to that in the way crowds do when someone says something that crosses a line everyone knew was there, but no one expected to see crossed so openly, with an uncomfortable shifting, a few murmurs, and then silence. Because silence is easier. Silence doesn't require you to do anything. Eliza felt something happen inside her that she hadn't expected. She had braced for fear. She had been living in fear for 4 days. A low, constant, exhausting fear that sat behind her eyes and in the back of her throat and made everything slightly unreal. She had expected the fear to get worse when she stood on this platform. Instead, something beneath the fear had gotten very still and very clear. She turned her head and looked directly at Victor Kane. "You can run this any way you want," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, but it was steady. "But my children stay with me. Whatever you decide for me, they stay with me." Kane looked at her for a moment. The smile didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. "That," he said, "isn't up to you." He said it without heat. That was the worst part. He said it the way you'd tell someone it wasn't up to them whether the sun rose, as a statement of fact so obvious it barely required saying. The bidding started. She stood very straight and didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes forward and kept her hands around her children's hands, and she made herself breathe at a normal rate because she understood that how she appeared right now mattered. Not to Kane, not to herself, but to Clara, who was watching her face to determine how scared to be. The first bid came from a man she half recognized, a farmer from the south edge of the county who needed kitchen labor and had 3 sons and a wife who looked exhausted at every town gathering. The number, he said, was low, humiliatingly low. The kind of number you'd offer for a cow you weren't sure about. 2 more bids followed, each nearly as low. There was a quality to the bidding that felt like theater. Like the men raising their voices already understood this was concluded, and they were just going through the motions. Kane's smile had settled into something satisfied. She was calculating. Even in the middle of it, even standing on that platform with her son's fist in her skirt and her daughter's hand going white-knuckled in hers, she was calculating. What happened if Kane got what he wanted? What happened to the children? Whether there was any version of this that didn't end with Clara and Benjamin separated from her. She could not find one. She had been looking for it since she walked into the square, and she could not find it. And then, from the back of the crowd, a voice. $500. The square went completely silent. Eliza's head turned before she told it to. She had seen Nathan Cole before, the way you see prominent men in small frontier towns, at a distance, in passing, at community events where his presence registered because men of his standing created a kind of gravity in a room. He owned Raven Hollow Ranch, 12 miles out on the eastern stretch, and the ranch was large enough that its size had passed into local mythology. He was tall, with the kind of weathered stillness that comes not from ease, but from long practice at controlling what you show. He was not smiling, he was looking at Kane. $500, he repeated. Not louder, just clearer, in case there had been any confusion. Kane's face had done something interesting. The practiced ease was still there, but underneath it something had gone rigid. "Mr. Cole," he said, with the particular smoothness of a man buying time to think, "that's a generous sum." "It's a sufficient sum," Nathan said. He was moving through the crowd, which was parting for him the way crowds part for men who don't apologize for taking up space. "It covers the debts." "That's what you said this was about. Covering the debts." Kane opened his mouth. "Unless it's about something else," Nathan said. And he stopped walking and looked at Kane directly, and the look was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was certain. "Is it about something else, Victor?" The silence in the square had a different quality now. It wasn't the silence of people watching a transaction. It was the silence of people watching something that had shifted into a different category of event. Kane's jaw tightened once. Then the practiced ease came back. $500, he said. "Going to Nathan Cole of Raven Hollow Ranch." He waited the customary beat, looking around the crowd. "Going twice." Another beat. Nobody spoke. "Sold." Eliza stood on the platform and did not fully understand what had just happened. She understood the mechanics of it. A bid, a sale, a transfer. She understood that Victor Kane had just lost something he'd expected to have. She understood that the man now walking toward the platform with a calm, unhurried step, owned a ranch 12 miles east and had just paid $500 for the right to determine what happened to her and her children. What she did not understand was why. She watched him come up the 3 steps onto the platform. He was closer now than he'd been across the crowd. She could see the sun damage on his face, the slight asymmetry of a nose that had been broken and hadn't set quite right. His eyes were dark and direct, and when they found hers, they didn't slide away. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Cole. My wagon's at the north end of the street. Whenever you're ready." He said it simply. Not as an order, exactly. But there was no question embedded in it either. He had just paid $500, and he was telling her where his wagon was, and she was standing on a platform in the middle of Caldwell Creek with 2 children and everything she owned in a bag Ruth had lent her, and there was nowhere else to go. She looked at Clara, who was watching Nathan Cole with the careful, measuring look that children sometimes give strangers. The particular attention of a child who has learned that adults can surprise you badly and is trying to read the signs before it happens again. She looked at Benjamin, who had come out from behind her leg and was looking at Nathan's horse, tied at the platform rail, with an expression that on any other day would have made her smile. She looked at Victor Kane, who was watching from the other end of the platform. The smile was gone now. What was left under it was not something she wanted to spend another second looking at. She picked up her bag. "All right," she said. She walked down the platform steps with her children, and she did not look back at the square, at Kane, at the crowd of faces that had watched all of this and said nothing. She walked toward the north end of the street, and she kept walking. She did not know what was waiting for her at Raven Hollow Ranch. She did not know what Nathan Cole expected from the $500 he had spent on her freedom, or whether freedom was even the word for what this was. She didn't know anything yet, except that her children were beside her and the platform was behind her, and every step she took in this direction was a step away from Victor Kane's grin. She had made herself a promise that morning, kneeling in the dirt. She was still keeping it. Benjamin reached up and took her hand as they walked, his small fingers finding hers without looking. Clara walked on her other side, quiet and upright, her chin at that precise angle that meant she was working hard not to cry. Eliza squeezed both their hands once. They kept walking. The wagon ride to Raven Hollow Ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and Nathan Cole said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes of it. Eliza didn't push. She sat on the bench beside him with Benjamin between them and Clara on her lap, and she watched the landscape change from the dust and compressed geometry of Caldwell Creek into something wider and more indifferent: scrub grass, distant ridge lines, the occasional dark shape of a hawk riding a thermal high above. The silence between her and Nathan was not comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't know each other and were being honest about it. Benjamin was the one who broke it. He was 5 years old and had apparently decided somewhere in the last mile that the silence was unnecessary. "How many horses do you have?" he asked Nathan. Nathan glanced down at him. 11? Benjamin considered this. "We had one. Papa sold it." Nathan said, "That's so. It was a brown one. I don't remember its name." "Horses don't usually need names." "Ours had one," Benjamin said. "I just don't remember what it was." Nathan made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been the beginning of something else that he decided not to finish. He kept his eyes on the road, but something in the set of his shoulders had shifted slightly, and Eliza noticed it the way she had learned to notice small things, the way a woman learns to read the weather in a man's posture before he's decided to show it in his face. Clara had fallen asleep against Eliza's shoulder sometime in the first hour. She slept the way exhausted children sleep, completely and without apology, her mouth slightly open, one hand still loosely curled around the strap of Eliza's bag. Eliza kept one arm around her and tried to keep her balance on the bench without waking her. "You don't have to explain yourself," Nathan said, about an hour in. She turned to look at him. "At the auction," he said. "I've heard things about Kane, about what he does with women he gets his hands on. You don't have to explain why you were there or what led to it." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't going to." He glanced at her sideways. Something in that glance was almost wry. "No, I don't suppose you were." She looked back at the road. "I'd still like to know what you expect." "Fair enough." He shifted the reins from one hand to the other. "My housekeeper left in March. Went to her daughter's in New Mexico. Family situation. The house has been running badly since. I need someone who can manage it. Cooking, supplies, keeping the hands from tearing the place apart. I'll pay you $1.50 a week, and your children will have a room and 3 meals. The work is real work. I'm not going to pretend it isn't." Eliza absorbed this. And my children are mine. Your children are yours, he said. I didn't buy them. I bought the debt. She didn't say anything to that. There was something in the plainness of it. I bought the debt. That was either the most mercenary or the most decent thing she'd heard in a week, and she couldn't quite decide which, and she thought maybe it was both. They came in around a long bend in the road, and the ranch spread out below them in the late afternoon light, and Eliza's first thought, which she did not say out loud, was that it was larger than she'd expected. The main house sat on a rise above the work buildings, solid, two-storied, with a porch that wrapped around the front and side. Below it, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smaller structure she couldn't identify, several corrals. The whole thing had the look of a place that had been built to last, and then had a few hard years, and was in the process of recovering. Benjamin sat up straight. He had been half asleep, and the sight of the corrals woke him completely. "Those are the horses?" he said. "Some of them," Nathan said. "Can I see them?" "Benjamin," Eliza said. "Tomorrow," Nathan said, "if your mother agrees." Benjamin looked at Eliza with the specific expression children use when they are trying to look calm about something they desperately want. She almost smiled. "We'll see," she said, which was the closest to yes she was willing to commit to on a day that had contained so much she hadn't been able to control. The first week was the hardest. Not because Nathan was difficult. He wasn't. Not in any way she'd prepared herself for. He was present in the house in the early mornings and the evenings, and largely absent in between, out on the range with his crew doing the endless labor that a ranch of that size required. He ate whatever she put in front of him without complaint, gave her access to the supply ledger without being asked, and showed her around the house the first morning in a tour that was thorough and entirely businesslike. He did not hover. He did not watch her. He did not ask questions she hadn't invited. This was not what she had expected, and the gap between what she'd expected and what she found made her more unsettled, not less. She had braced for something she could push against. She didn't know what to do with a situation that simply required her to work. The house was genuinely in poor condition. Not the structure itself. The walls and floors were sound, but the management of it. The pantry had been stocked with no system. There were supplies doubled in some areas and completely absent in others. The previous housekeeper had apparently used a filing system for the accounts that made sense only to her, and 3 months of neglect had added chaos on top of confusion. The kitchen was usable but had the particular griminess of a room that strong men had been cooking in without really cleaning. Eliza spent the first 3 days doing nothing but assessing and organizing. She made lists. She went through every cabinet and drawer and corner. She found a cracked window in the back bedroom that had been stuffed with rags to keep the wind out. She found a water stain on the ceiling of the front room that suggested a roof issue she'd need to mention. She found, in a drawer in the kitchen, a single child's drawing, crayon on butcher paper, 2 figures and something that might have been a horse. And she looked at it for a moment and then set it carefully to the side because it didn't belong in a drawer, and she didn't know where it did belong, but she wasn't going to throw it away. She didn't ask Nathan about the drawing. He didn't ask her what she'd found it. The ranch hands were a different kind of challenge. There were 6 of them, ranging from a man in his 50s named Chet, who had worked for Nathan for 12 years and regarded Eliza with a kind of watchful neutrality, to a 20-year-old named Robbie, who regarded everything with the undifferentiated enthusiasm of someone who had not yet been disappointed enough times. The ones in between were various. They were not unkind to her, but they were men who had been operating without a household manager for 3 months, which meant they had developed habits and shortcuts and informal arrangements that her presence now complicated. The first time she told the 2 youngest to stop eating from the pot before meals were served, they looked at her with the expression of people who had not been told no in long enough that they'd forgotten it was an option. "Nathan doesn't mind," one of them said. His name was Dylan. He was 19. "I mind," Eliza said. There was a silence. Dylan looked at the pot, and then at her, and made the calculation that most 19-year-old men make when a woman with that particular quality of stillness tells them something is not open for discussion. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Chet, who had been watching from the doorway, made no expression at all, but he turned and walked away, and Eliza had the sense he approved. Clara and Benjamin adapted in the ways that children do, which is to say, unpredictably and completely. Benjamin fell in love with the ranch within approximately 2 days. The horses were part of it, but so was the space, the sheer amount of room to run in, the absence of town noises, the fact that nobody here looked at him the way people in Caldwell Creek had looked at him the last week of his father's life, with that particular adult pity that children register even when they don't have words for it. He started following Chet around in the afternoons. Chet tolerated this with the resigned patience of a man who has been followed by children before and found it less objectionable than expected. Clara took longer. She was 7 and understood more, which was the problem. She had stood on that platform. She had felt her mother's hand grip hers and felt the quality of that grip, the steadiness that was deliberate, that was her mother choosing how to hold her rather than how she actually felt. Clara was old enough to know the difference between those two things, and it had scared her in a way that the auction itself hadn't quite. She stayed close to Eliza for the first week. She helped in the kitchen without being asked. She folded her clothes and made her bed in the room she shared with Benjamin, with a precision that was not natural for a 7-year-old, but was a 7-year-old's version of trying to be no trouble. Eliza noticed and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The room she and the children shared was small but clean, a real bed for Eliza and a cot that the ranch had used for a previous hire. It had a window that faced east and let in the morning light. The first morning Eliza woke in it, she lay still for several seconds, disoriented by the quality of the silence, which was different from town silence. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of different noise, wind, and animals and distance. Then she remembered where she was and why, and she got up and started the morning fire. It was on the 6th night that Nathan came in later than usual, long after the children were in bed, and found her still in the kitchen working through the supply accounts by lamplight. She had been trying to reconcile 3 months of inconsistent entries, and it was slow, painstaking work. He stopped in the doorway. "You don't need to do that tonight," he said. "I know." She didn't look up from the ledger. "I'll sleep better if I understand what I'm working with." He came in and set his hat on the peg by the door and poured himself water from the pitcher. He stood by the window for a moment, and she could tell from the way he was standing that he'd had a difficult day, the kind that settles into a man's back and the line of his jaw. "Chet says your son has a feel for horses," he said. She looked up then. "Benjamin's been bothering Chet." "Chet's not bothered." Nathan sat down at the far end of the table, not near her, not positioned like a man trying to get close, just finding a chair. "Chet doesn't suffer things he doesn't want to. If your boy was a nuisance, he'd have said so." Eliza looked at him for a moment. "He's a good boy." "I can see that." There was a pause that was different in quality from the pauses of the wagon ride, set less cautious, more settled. She went back to the ledger. He finished his water. "There's a ceiling issue in the front room," she said. "Water stain. Might be a loose shingle, might be something worse. I'd have someone look at it before the fall rains." "I know about it." Knowing about it and fixing it are different things. He was quiet a moment. "You've been here 6 days." "The ceiling's been leaking longer than 6 days." Another pause. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile. "I'll have Chet look at it," he said. She made a note in the margin of the ledger. It was not a friendship yet. It was not anything she had a word for. But it was, she thought, something real. 2 people being honest with each other inside an arrangement that had started as necessity and was, quietly, beginning to be something else. She didn't know what to do with that. She decided, as she had been deciding most things this week, to simply keep working and let it develop at whatever pace it wanted. The letter arrived on the 11th day. She knew before she opened it who it was from. The handwriting on the envelope was too careful, the deliberateness of a man who doesn't write often and is using the formality of good penmanship to communicate something about himself. The return address was the P.O. box in Caldwell Creek. She opened it in the kitchen, alone, the children outside, Nathan out on the range. It was 3 sentences long. "You made a mistake going with Cole. What you owe isn't cleared by his money. It's transferred. Come back to town before things get complicated and we'll work something out reasonable." It was signed V. Kane, in the same careful hand. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it and thought about what it actually said, underneath what it said. What it said underneath was, "I'm not done with you." She put the letter in the drawer of the supply cabinet, under the account ledger, where it would not be visible. She did not decide immediately what to do with it. She needed to think about it, and she needed to think about it without her face showing what she was thinking, because Clara was going to walk back in from the yard in approximately 3 minutes, and Clara was too good at reading her face. She started on the afternoon bread. Hands busy, mind working. The question was whether to tell Nathan. She ran through the reasons to and the reasons not to. The reasons, too, were practical. He had paid $500, and whatever he'd said about the debt, the reality was that Victor Kane was now making his own counterclaim on a transaction Nathan had been part of, and Nathan had a right to know that. The reasons not to were more complicated and less logical, and mostly amounted to the fact that she had been managing her own dangers alone for 11 days, and the idea of handing the information to someone else felt like a kind of surrender she wasn't ready for. Clara came back in from the yard with Benjamin behind her. Benjamin had something in his hand that turned out to be a smooth, flat stone he'd found by the water trough. "Can I keep it?" he asked. "It's a rock," Eliza said. "It's a good rock." "You can keep it," she said. "Don't put it in your pocket. You'll forget and it'll go through the wash." He put it in his pocket immediately. She didn't say anything else about it. That evening, after supper, Nathan was on the porch. She had seen him go out, and she had washed the dishes and checked that the children were settled, and then she took her time deciding whether to go outside. Because once she went outside and started this conversation, she couldn't unstart it. She went outside. He was leaning against the porch rail with a cup of coffee, looking east toward the ridgeline where the last light was sitting. He heard her come out, but didn't turn around right away. "Kane sent a letter," she said. Now he turned. She told him what it said. All 3 sentences, without editorializing. She watched his face while she said it, and his face did not change very much, which told her he was not surprised, only that the timeline had been confirmed. "I figured he'd make contact," Nathan said. "I didn't know how fast." "You expected this." "I expected Kane to be Kane." He set down his coffee. "He doesn't let things go. It's not in his character." "What does he actually want?" she said. "With me specifically. He has money. He has the saloon. He has half the town already." Nathan was quiet for a moment, and she could tell from the quality of the quiet that he was deciding how much to say. "Kane buys things," he said finally. "Properties, businesses, sometimes people. It's not about any particular thing. It's about the collection. He had a plan for you at that auction, and I got in the way of it. And for Kane, that's 2 problems. You and me." "He put you in his letter." "Did he?" "He said what I owe isn't cleared by your money. It's transferred." Nathan picked up his coffee again and looked at it. "He means that in his version of events, you still owe a debt, and I've just changed who holds it." "That's not what happened." "No," he said. "It's not." He looked out at the ridge. "But Kane writes his own version of things, and then he enforces it, and that's worked for him for a long time in that county because nobody's pushed back hard enough." She stood beside him and looked out at the same ridge, the last light nearly gone now, the sky at the horizon going from orange to a deep bruised blue. "I'm not going back to town," she said. "I didn't ask you to. I'm not going back, and I'm not reaching any kind of arrangement with him. I want to be clear about that." He turned to look at her then, and there was something direct in the look. Not challenging, not warm exactly, but the look of a man who is paying full attention. "I didn't buy you," he said, "at that auction. I want to be clear about that too." She held his gaze. "Then what did you do?" He was quiet for a beat. "The only thing I could think of," he said. It wasn't a satisfying answer. It was, in fact, a maddening one, vague in the way that a man who doesn't yet know how to say what he means is often vague, gesturing at something real without landing on it. She let it sit there. She didn't push for more because she could sense he didn't have more in him tonight, and because she had her own version of that feeling, knowing something was true without yet having the words for it. The days that followed were uneasy in a way that was different from the first week's unease. The first week had been the unease of a new place, new people, new rhythms. This was something sharper. She kept the letter in the supply drawer, and every time she opened that drawer, she felt the edge of it. She started watching the road. She wasn't melodramatic about it. She didn't stand at windows wringing her hands. But she was aware of the road in a way she hadn't been before, in the peripheral way that people develop when they're waiting for something they can't schedule. When riders came up the main approach, she noticed before anyone said anything. She registered the sound of hooves at a distance and calculated whether it was the usual traffic or something different. Nothing came the first week after the letter. Or rather, nothing came directly. What came was a man named Tom Gillick, who worked for Kane's gaming hall and showed up at the edge of the ranch property on a Wednesday afternoon, ostensibly to ask about buying a horse. Nathan wasn't home. Chet handled it. Gillick left without buying a horse, because there were no horses for sale, and everyone including Gillick knew that, and afterward Chet came and found Eliza in the kitchen. "That was Kane's man," he said. "I know," she said. She was cutting vegetables and she didn't stop. Chet looked at her for a moment. Nathan know about the letter? Yes. He made the same sound he'd made in the first week. The non-committal acknowledgement that might mean anything but coming from him probably meant something specific. He left without saying anything else. That night Nathan came home later than usual, and she could tell from the careful way he moved when he came in that he'd heard about Gillick. She was in the kitchen, and he went to the study, and she heard him in there for a while. Then he came out. Gillick was here, he said. Chet told me. He won't be the last. He poured water, drank it. Kane sends people first to look, figure out the lay of things. Then he decides what he actually wants to do. How long does that take him? Depends on what he's planning. Nathan put down the cup. I want to ride into Caldwell Creek next week, talk to the county clerk. There are some filings I should have made after the auction. Property transfer documentation, debt discharge. If those are on record, it makes Kane's claim a lot harder to pursue. Eliza looked at him. You didn't do that already? I should have, he said, and he said it flatly, without excuse, the way a man acknowledges a mistake when he knows he made one. I figured the payment was enough. I wasn't thinking about Kane moving this fast. She absorbed this. He had made an error. He was saying so directly. She filed that, not with judgment, but as information about who he was, which was a person who made mistakes and didn't dress them up. When you file the documentation, she said carefully, what does that mean for me, legally? It means the debt is discharged. You don't owe Kane anything. You don't owe anyone anything. And what do I owe you? He looked at her. The $1.50 a week we agreed on. She held his gaze. That's all. That's all, he said. She turned back to the counter. She had been in the middle of something before he came in. She couldn't remember now what it was. Her hands found a cloth and she folded it, unnecessarily. All right, she said, file the papers. The thing she had not expected about Raven Hollow Ranch, about this whole situation, was the way ordinary life kept happening inside it. She was carrying genuine fear about Kane, real, specific, grounded fear, not anxiety, but the practical dread of a woman who has looked at a dangerous man's face and understood that he meant what he implied. She was carrying uncertainty about Nathan, about what this arrangement actually was, and what it was becoming, and whether she was capable of trusting it. She was managing a household and 2 children and a crew of men and accounts that still weren't fully reconciled, and underneath all of that, her daughter was starting to laugh again. It happened first on a Thursday, 12 days after they arrived. Robbie, the youngest hand, was trying to catch a chicken that had gotten out of the coop, and he was doing it with the spectacular ineptitude of a person who had never in his life chased a chicken. The chicken was making him look foolish in the specific way that chickens make even capable adults look foolish, and Clara was watching from the porch and she started laughing. Not the polite social laugh of a child performing happiness, but the real kind, the helpless kind, the kind that bends you forward slightly. Eliza heard it from inside the house, and she stopped what she was doing and she just stood there for a moment. It had been nearly 3 weeks since she'd heard that sound. She hadn't known how much she'd been measuring time in its absence until it was there again, coming through the screen door in the afternoon light. She went back to work. But something had loosened, very slightly, somewhere in the region of her sternum, like a knot that hasn't come undone yet but has shifted enough that you know it eventually will. Nathan noticed things she was learning. He noticed them without announcing that he was noticing, which was its own kind of noticing. He had started leaving a small amount of the morning coffee in the pot because he'd noticed she came down after the children were settled and made a second cup in the evening. He had moved the supply ledger from the cabinet shelf to the kitchen table without comment after she spent 3 consecutive evenings carrying it back and forth. He had said nothing to her directly about any of this. Neither had she. It was Chet who finally gave her what might have been the most useful piece of information she'd gotten since arriving. They were in the barn on a Saturday morning. Eliza was there because Benjamin had asked, she was there because he was 5, and Chet was there because it was Saturday, and the barn was where Chet was on Saturday mornings. Benjamin was talking to a bay mare through the stall door with the focused intensity of someone having an important conversation. Nathan's a fair man, Chet said. He wasn't looking at her. He was working at a piece of tack that needed repair. He doesn't say much, and he doesn't explain himself much, but he's fair. I've worked for him 10 years, going on 12. He's never done a thing I've seen that wasn't square. Eliza waited. He had a wife, Chet said, 7 years back, and a son. She kept her eyes on Benjamin at the stall door. Fever, Chet said. It took them both inside of 2 weeks. The boy was 2 years old. The barn was quiet except for the sounds horses make, the shifting of weight, the occasional breath, the soft percussion of a hoof. Benjamin was still talking to the mare. The mare was listening with the patient attention that horses sometimes give to children. "He's not told me to tell you this," Chet said, "and he probably won't tell you himself. I'm telling you because you're a woman in a difficult situation and you're trying to figure out who Nathan Cole is, and I think you deserve to have a piece of it." She looked at Chet then. He was still working on the tack. "Thank you," she said. He made the sound. She stood in the barn for another few minutes and watched her son talk to a horse and thought about a man who had lost a 2-year-old boy and a wife within 2 weeks and then had gone on, in the way people go on, and had built something. Not happiness exactly, but a working life, a ranch, a crew of men who respected him. She thought about what it costs a person to do that, what it takes from them, and what, if anything, it leaves behind. She did not have a category for Nathan Cole yet. She had been trying to find one since the auction. A familiar shape to put him in, a type she recognized, so she'd know what to watch for and what to trust. She still didn't have one. Maybe, she thought, he wasn't a type. Maybe he was just himself. It was 3 weeks after their arrival that Victor Kane came in person. She saw the riders from the kitchen window, 3 of them, coming up the main road in the late morning at a pace that was deliberate, not rushed. The pace of men who have decided what they're doing and aren't worried about being seen doing it. She recognized Kane from a distance by the set of his shoulders, the clean hat. He rode like a man who owns his space. Nathan was in the east pasture. She had seen him ride out an hour ago. Chet was at the barn. She went to the door and called him, twice, with a directness that made him come at a quick walk without asking why. "Kane," she said. Chet looked at the road. His expression did not change. "Get the children inside." She had already been thinking that. Clara was on the porch. She'd been out there since after breakfast. And Benjamin was somewhere near the water trough with his stone collection. Eliza went and got them both, not rushing, not running, moving with the calm efficiency of a woman who has decided how this is going to go. "Inside," she said. "Both of you. Front room." "Why?" Clara said. "Because I said so," Eliza said. "Come on." She got them inside and left them in the front room with instructions to stay there. Then she went back to the kitchen and she stood at the kitchen window and watched Kane and his 2 riders come up to the front of the house. Chet was already there. He was standing in the yard with the quality of stillness that Eliza had come to recognize in him. The stillness of a man who is calm because he has decided to be, not because the situation warranted it. Kane dismounted. He looked at Chet and then at the house, and then his eyes found the kitchen window, found her in it. He smiled. It was the same smile from the platform, the one that said he already knew how this ended. She did not step back from the window. She heard him say something to Chet that she couldn't make out through the glass. She heard Chet's response, which she also couldn't make out, but whose brevity suggested it was not a cooperative one. Then she heard Kane's voice again, louder this time, directed not at Chet, but at the house itself. "Mrs. Hartwell, why don't you come out and we can have a civilized conversation?" Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Mom, go back in the front room, Clara." "Who is that man?" "Someone I need to deal with," Eliza said. "Go back to the front room and stay with your brother." Clara looked at her for one moment, that measuring look, the one that knew things. And then she went. Eliza took off her apron and set it on the counter. She walked to the kitchen door, opened it, and went out onto the porch. The sun was direct and sharp, and she stood in it without flinching. Kane looked up at her from the yard with the smile in place. "I was beginning to think you weren't home," he said. "I was in the kitchen," she said, "working, because that's what I'm here to do." He took a step toward the porch. Chet moved, not dramatically, not fast, but in a way that repositioned him between Kane and the porch steps. Kane noticed it. His eyes went from Chet to Eliza and back. "I came to make you an offer," he said. "A real one. Not the auction business. That was the county's proceeding. That wasn't personal. I'm talking about an arrangement that actually makes sense for someone in your position." "I have an arrangement," she said. "I work here. I'm paid. My children are safe." "For now," Kane said. She held his gaze. "What does that mean?" He spread his hands, the same gesture from the platform. Open, reasonable, the gesture of a man making a generous offer out of pure goodwill. "Cole's a decent man, but he's got problems. There are riders in the eastern range who've been cutting his cattle. His water rights on the North Creek have been challenged. He's a man with a lot to manage and not enough hands to manage it. He paused. Operations like that tend to get unstable. I'd hate for you and your children to be caught in the middle of something like that. She understood what he was saying. He was telling her with elaborate politeness that the instability he was describing was not a prediction. It was a plan, or at least a threat intended to make her believe it was a plan. She thought about the letter in the supply drawer. She thought about Chet's face and Nathan's face, and Robbie chasing a chicken, and Clara laughing for the first time in 3 weeks. She thought about a 2-year-old boy who had died of fever, and a man who had gone on anyway and built something that someone was now threatening. "Mr. Kane," she said, "I think you should leave." His face did something. The smile stayed, but the area around it went still. "Mrs. Hartwell, the papers are being filed with the county clerk this week," she said. She didn't know for certain this was true. Nathan had said next week, but she said it as if she did, cleanly and without hesitation. "The debt is discharged. I don't owe you anything, and I don't owe your offer anything." Kane looked at her for a long moment. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but it's mine to make." She heard hooves then, from the direction of the east pasture, the particular sound of a horse being ridden at a pace that was faster than routine. Nathan coming back. Someone had gone to get him, or he'd seen the riders from the ridge, or some combination of the two. She didn't look away from Kane to check. Kane heard it too. His chin came up slightly. "We'll talk again," he said. "I don't think we will," she said. He held her eyes for another beat. Then he turned and remounted in one smooth motion and looked at Chet, and then at the house. And then he rode back down the main road with his 2 riders behind him in the same deliberate pace they'd come in. She stood on the porch and watched until they were small shapes at the bend in the road and then not visible at all. Nathan came into the yard at a canter and pulled up and looked at the road and then at her. "Chet sent Robbie to find me," he said. He was out of breath, not much, but slightly. He'd ridden fast. "How long was he here?" 10 minutes, maybe less." "What did he say?" She told him, all of it, verbatim or close enough. Nathan listened without interrupting, sitting on his horse with his hands still on the reins, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The water rights comment," he said. "That's not idle." "I know. He's been building a case with the county land office, trying to get the North Creek reclassified." He got down from the horse and handed the reins to Robbie, who had appeared from the direction of the barn. "It's not a strong case, but it's the kind of thing that costs time and money to fight." "And the riders cutting your cattle?" He looked at her. "How'd you know about that?" "Kane told me. I assumed it wasn't coincidental." A muscle in his jaw worked once. "No," he said. "It's not." She stepped off the porch and walked to where he was standing. She stopped close enough to talk normally, not close enough to be anything other than direct. "I told him the papers were being filed this week," she said. "I don't know if that was true." "I was going Monday," he said. "I'll go tomorrow." "Good." She looked at him. "He's not going to stop." "No," Nathan said. "He's not." The afternoon was long and quiet, in the way that afternoons are quiet after something has happened. A surface calm over the particular awareness of something changed. Eliza made supper, and the children came to the table, and Chet and 2 of the hands ate with them, which had become the informal arrangement on evenings when Nathan was present. It was not a comfortable meal exactly, but it was a present one. People around a table, food on plates, the ordinary commerce of eating and passing things, and the occasional word. Benjamin talked about the bay mare. Clara asked Chet whether horses could recognize faces, and Chet said they could, which sent Benjamin into a state of considerable excitement about what the mare must think of him specifically. Nathan ate and listened and said little, which was his way, but he listened fully, and at one point when Clara said something that was inadvertently funny, he made that sound again. The one that wasn't quite a laugh, but was as close as he seemed to get most evenings. Clara noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but Eliza saw her notice. After supper, after the children were in bed, Eliza went to the kitchen and opened the supply drawer and took out Kane's letter. She read it one more time. Then she carried it to the stove and opened the grate and put it in. She watched it catch and burn and become nothing in about 4 seconds. She closed the grate. She stood in the kitchen in the quiet of the house, and she thought, she was still afraid. The fear was still real, and it was still specific, and it was not the kind of fear that a letter burning was going to fix. But she had stood on the porch today, and she had not moved and Kane had left, and that meant something. Not that she had won, not that anything was resolved, but that she had stood her ground in her place, on the porch of a ranch she had arrived at with nothing, and she had not moved, and he had left. That was the thing that had happened. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went to bed. Nathan rode to the county clerk's office the next morning before the sun was fully up, and he was back by mid-afternoon with the documentation folded in his coat pocket and an expression that told Eliza the ride had not been entirely straightforward. He didn't explain immediately. He came in, washed the road dust off his hands and face at the kitchen basin, and accepted the coffee she set in front of him without comment. She waited. She had learned by now that Nathan processed things on his own schedule, and that pushing for information before he was ready to give, it produced less than waiting. The clerk had already received a filing, he said finally. She set down the pot. From Kane. From Kane's lawyer, a man named Burwell, who works out of the county seat. Nathan looked at the coffee cup. The filing is a counterclaim on the debt discharge. It argues that because the auction was conducted under the county's authority, any private payment made by a third party, me, doesn't legally discharge the original obligation. It just creates a new debtor relationship. That's what his letter said. His lawyer said it in language that sounds like law. He looked up at her. It may not hold. The clerk didn't know. He's sending it to a judge in Denver for a ruling. How long does that take? Weeks, maybe longer. She sat down across from him. So until then, Kane's argument exists on paper, which gives him something to point at. He turned the cup in his hands. It's not a strong claim, but it doesn't need to be strong. It just needs to be present. It creates uncertainty, and Kane does well in uncertain situations. She thought about what he'd said on the porch the night of Kane's visit. He's not going to stop. She had known it was true when she said it back to him, but there is knowing something, and then there is the specific weight of it arriving in official language filed with a county clerk. What does Burwell want? She said. For Kane. What's the actual goal? Nathan was quiet a moment. If I had to name it, he wants the ranch. She looked at him. Not you specifically, he said. Or not just you. The water rights dispute, the cattle, the legal filing, they're all pressure points. Kane's been acquiring land in this county for 4 years. Raven Hollow sits on the North Creek, which feeds 3 other properties south of here. If he controls the creek, he controls a lot more than one ranch. He set down the cup. You walked into a situation that was already developing. She absorbed that. You should have told me. I know. Before I stood on that porch and told him the papers were filed. You handled it, he said. You handled it well. I handled it without information, she said. Those are different things. He looked at her directly, and he didn't argue with that because it was accurate and he knew it. You're right, he said. I should have told you. It was not an easy admission for a man like Nathan. She could see that. It didn't come easily, the way some men's apologies come easily, smoothly, meaning nothing. It came with resistance and then arrived plain, and she decided it was worth more than the smooth kind. Tell me the rest, she said. Whatever you haven't told me. All of it. He told her. The cattle cutting had been going on for 6 weeks, starting about 2 weeks before the auction. 3 men, never the same configuration twice, always at night, never leaving a clear trail. He'd lost 11 head so far, scattered deliberately rather than stolen outright, designed to create loss and confusion rather than actual theft, because theft could be pursued legally. He'd told the sheriff. The sheriff had sent a deputy who'd ridden the fence line, found nothing, written a report, and gone home. The water rights challenge had been filed 5 weeks ago by a land consortium that, when you trace the names through 2 layers of third-party ownership, connected back to a holding company with a P.O. box in Denver that Kane's lawyer Burwell also represented. He knew all of this. He had known most of it before the auction. She listened to the full account, and when he was done, she sat with it for a moment. You went to the auction anyway, she said. I was already planning to be in town that day. That's not what I asked. He looked at the table. Yes, he said. I went knowing what Kane was doing. Why? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, because standing in that square and watching him run that auction and not doing anything was something I wasn't able to do. She understood that it was not an entirely rational answer. She also understood that it was a true one. The weeks that followed were ones Eliza would remember in fragments, not as a continuous experience, but as a series of distinct, sharp-edged moments, separated by the blur of routine work that kept the household running, regardless of whatever else was happening. There was the morning she found 2 of the fence posts on the south line pulled from the ground and lying flat. which meant someone had been on the property overnight and had done it quietly enough that neither the dogs nor Chet had registered anything. Nathan and Chet rode the South Line together that afternoon and found 3 more sections disturbed. They reset the posts, and Nathan was quiet at supper that evening in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Not contained exactly, but compressed, the way weather compresses before it breaks. There was the afternoon Robbie came in from town with the news that Kane had bought the Lander property at the county's southern end, which meant he now had land on 2 sides of Raven Hollow's outer range. Chet heard this and said nothing. Nathan heard it at supper and said nothing either, but his jaw held a particular tension for the rest of the meal. There was the Tuesday morning that a man Eliza didn't recognize rode up to the ranch house alone and asked to speak with Nathan, said he had information about the riders cutting cattle, and when Nathan went out to talk to him, the conversation lasted 20 minutes, and Nathan came back in with a look on his face that Eliza couldn't fully read. "What?" she said. "He says Kane hired 3 men out of Pueblo specifically for the fence and cattle work," Nathan said. "He knows 2 of their names." "Who is he?" "Used to work for Kane. Fell out with him over money." "Can you trust him?" Nathan sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. "I don't know. Could be genuine. Could be Kane sending someone to see what I'll do with the information." He put both hands flat on the table. "Either way, he gave me names." "Which you'll take to the sheriff." "Which the sheriff will file in a drawer." She looked at him. "Then who?" He looked back. "The U.S. Marshal's office in Denver has jurisdiction over organized criminal interference with land and livestock rights. If I can get documentation together, names, dates, the legal filings, the debt claim. A federal filing is different from a county sheriff complaint. How long to put that together?" "A week, maybe 2. "Then start tomorrow," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not gratitude exactly, but the recognition of being met directly, of someone not flinching at the shape of the thing. "It costs money to pursue federal," he said. "Lawyer fees." "I know," she said, "but not pursuing it also costs, just differently." He held her gaze. Then he nodded once and got up from the table. The next morning he started on the documentation. She helped. She hadn't offered, it wasn't her place to offer, it was his ranch and his legal fight. But on the second day she was in the supply room going through the account ledger, and she noticed that the records she needed to cross-reference were the same dates as the cattle losses Nathan had written in his log. And she had both documents in her hands anyway, and it made sense to put them side by side and note the pattern, which she did. And when Nathan came in that afternoon, she had a 2-page summary written out in her clear hand, dates, amounts, cross-referenced against the fence incidents, and the legal filings. He stood at the table and read it without a word. Then he sat down and read it again. "The timing of the water rights filing," he said. 3 days after the first cattle incident," she said. "And the debt claim was filed the day after you came to the clerk with the discharge papers. He's responding to your moves." Which means he has someone watching. She had thought that. She hadn't said it until now because she wanted him to see it in the documents, not just hear it from her. "Yes," she said. "Someone who knows your schedule, who knew you'd go to the clerk the day after Kane's visit." Nathan looked at the window. The expression on his face was the one that meant he was running through a list in his mind. "Chet told Robbie to go get me when Kane showed up," he said. "That's Chet and Robbie. I trust Chet with my life." "Robbie?" He pressed his mouth together. "Robbie's young, not malicious. I'd stake money on that. But young men talk." "In town?" "Robbie goes to town on Saturdays." He looked at her. "Kane's gaming hall is in town." She thought about this. "You can't know for certain." "No," he said. "I can't." It was the kind of problem that had no clean solution. The kind that required either confronting something on incomplete evidence or letting it sit and watching what developed. Nathan chose the second, which she thought was right. He said nothing to Robbie. He simply adjusted what Robbie knew and when. Clara had started helping in the kitchen more intentionally by this point. Not the anxious helpfulness of the first week, but the genuine interest of a child who found cooking interesting. She had a particular aptitude for the arithmetic of it, the measuring and timing, and she liked to understand the reasons behind steps rather than just following instructions. Eliza had started explaining the why of things as they went, which kept Clara engaged and also, she realized, was the kind of explaining she'd never quite had herself. Her own mother had taught by demonstration rather than reason, and there was something Eliza was doing differently with her daughter without having decided to. Benjamin had graduated from talking to the bay mare through the stall door to being allowed inside the stall, which Chet had permitted after 2 weeks of observation. He stood next to the horse's shoulder with his small hand flat on her flank, and the expression he wore was the purest thing Eliza had seen on his face since before Martin died. She watched it from the barn doorway without going in, because it was his moment and she didn't want to complicate it. Chet appeared beside her at the doorway. "That horse doesn't let most adults in the stall," he said. "She lets Benjamin. She let Nathan once, first month after he got her." He watched Benjamin for a moment. "Horse picks her people." Eliza looked at Chet sideways. "Are you saying my 5-year-old was chosen by a horse?" "I'm saying the horse isn't wrong," Chet said, and walked away. She almost laughed. She didn't quite, because she was still carrying too much to get all the way there, but it was close. It was Nathan who told her on a Thursday evening in the 5th week what was coming. He said it plainly, sitting on the porch after supper, which had become the time when they talked about things that needed talking about. Not by arrangement, just by the natural gravity of the day's quiet coming at that hour. "I got word today from a man over in Gilmore County," he said. "Kane's been hiring riders, not 3 men, 8 or more, out of Pueblo and Colorado Springs, men who do range work and don't ask many questions about what kind." She looked at him. "When?" "My source said this week. That's all I know." She thought about the children in the house behind her, the east-facing window in their room, the lamp she could see through the glass, the pale glow of it. "Do you think he'd actually attack the ranch?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. It was her saying it out loud to hear how it sounded. "Kane doesn't like to get his hands dirty," Nathan said. "But I've been filing documentation with federal authorities, and he knows it. A man who sees his plans coming apart sometimes makes decisions he wouldn't make otherwise. You need to tell your hands. I told Chet today. All of them. They need to know what might be coming." He looked at her. "They're ranch hands, not fighters. They're men who've chosen to work for you," she said, "and some of them have been here years. They deserve to know what they might be in the middle of." She held his gaze. "Tell them." He called a meeting the following morning before the workday started. All 6 hands in the barn, standing in a loose group. He told them what he knew, kept it factual, didn't dramatize. He said he understood if anyone wanted to go to another outfit temporarily, and that he wouldn't hold it against a man who made that choice. None of them left. Chet didn't say anything, which was his version of an answer. Dylan and his fellow youngest hand exchanged a look that contained something young men's looks contain when they're about to be serious for the first time and are working out whether they're capable of it. Robbie looked at his boots and then straightened up. "What do you need us to do?" Robbie asked. Nathan told them, rotating watches through the night, 2 men at a time on the high points that gave sight lines to the main approaches. No fires after dark on the range. The horses moved to the inner corral closest to the barn. Supplies checked and inventoried in case of extended need. Eliza stood at the back of the group and listened. That same afternoon, she went to the kitchen, and she stood at the cabinet under the dry goods shelf, and she opened the lower door and looked at what was there. She did this deliberately, with intention. The family had come here with nothing, but Raven Hollow had a cabinet of practical items accumulated over years, and what she was looking for was there. A shotgun, older but maintained, and a box of shells. She took both out. She broke the gun open, checked the barrels, closed it. She loaded it and set it on the kitchen shelf behind the flour canister where it was accessible to her and not to the children. She did not tell Nathan she had done this. Not because she was hiding it, he could see the shelf as easily as she could, but because it didn't require discussion. It was a practical decision made by a person in a situation that required practical decisions, and she had made it. That night, after she'd settled the children, she went to Clara's bedside and sat on the edge. Clara was not asleep. She had been watching the ceiling with the particular look of a child working something out. "Mom," she said. "What? Is something going to happen?" Eliza looked at her daughter. She had learned in the last weeks that Clara could detect lies and partial truths with the accuracy of someone who has had to depend on reading adults accurately, and that lying to her was not protection. It was just disrespect dressed up as care. "Maybe," she said. "I don't know for certain." Clara was quiet. "But here's what I know," Eliza said. "You and Benjamin are in this house, and I am in this house, and I am not going anywhere. Understood?" "Yes." "And Mr. Cole and Chet and the hands are watching." She paused. "This is a ranch that knows how to take care of itself. We're going to be all right." Clara looked at her. "How do you know?" "I don't know," Eliza said. "But I'm choosing to act like it, because that's the only way any of this works." Clara thought about this for a moment with the serious consideration she gave all information that mattered. Okay, she said. Sleep now. She sat there until Clara's eyes closed, and then she went to check on Benjamin, who was already deeply asleep with his stone on the nightstand beside him and his mouth open and one arm hanging off the cot. She straightened his arm and pulled the blanket up. She stood in the doorway of that room for a moment and looked at her two children and felt the full weight of what she was carrying. Not fear exactly, or not only fear, but the complete awareness of what she was responsible for and what it would cost if she got it wrong. Then she went back to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark for a while, just sitting, just breathing, letting the quiet of the house settle around her. The attack came on the 9th day after Nathan's warning. Not at night the way they'd prepared for. At dusk, when the light was wrong. That half hour when shapes lose their edges and distance is hard to judge. She heard the cattle first, not a normal sound. Not the settling movement of animals finding their evening places, but something panicked. A collective bellowing that built fast and had a direction to it, coming from the south range where the main herd. She heard it, and she went still. Then she heard Chet shouting something from the direction of the barn. Then she smelled smoke. She was at the window before the thought completed itself. She could see the south range from the kitchen window, or its near edge, and what she could see was wrong. The shapes of cattle moving fast in a direction they didn't naturally move, and beyond them, at the far tree line, something orange. Fire. She turned from the window and went to the shelf and took the shotgun from behind the flour canister in one motion. She broke it, checked it, closed it, loaded. She had already done this 3 days ago and checked it every morning since. She went to the children's room. They were both awake. The noise had woken them. "Under the bed," she said. "Both of you, now." "Mom," Clara started. "Now, Clara. Benjamin, with your sister. Under the bed, and you stay there until I come to get you. Both of you. Do not come out for any reason except me." Benjamin looked at her face and slid off the cot and went under without another word. Clara followed. Eliza pulled the bed skirt down so it covered the gap to the floor. She stood up. "Don't make noise," she said. "Don't move. I'll be back." She went back to the kitchen. Through the window she could see the barn now, and she could see Nathan mounting up in the main yard, moving fast, shouting something to Dylan, who was running toward the outer fence. Chet was visible near the barn door, directing 2 of the other hands. The south range fire was bigger now. She could see the glow of it clearly over the tree line, and the cattle were moving in full panic. She could hear them, the sound of it like something liquid and unstoppable. Then she heard something else. Riders. Coming from the north, not the south, from the direction opposite the fire, which meant the fire was the direction you were supposed to look. She understood this in the second she heard it. She went to the front of the house and looked through the front room window. 3 riders coming up the main road. Fast. Not trying to be quiet now. She counted 3 and then saw a 4th behind and possibly a 5th further back in the fading light. She went to the front door and stood to the side of it, not in front of it, back against the wall beside the frame. The shotgun in both hands, stock against her shoulder, muzzle pointed at the door. She was afraid. She was aware of being afraid with a clarity that was almost like calm. The way extreme fear sometimes sharpens into something usable if you let it. She was afraid, and her hands were steady, and she was standing in the front hallway of the house with her back against the wall, because that was the thing to do. She heard hooves stop in the yard, close, a voice outside. "Anyone in the house, come out." She didn't move. "We're not here for a fight," the voice said. "Kane wants the woman and the kids. They come out calm. Nobody gets hurt." She breathed. "Last chance," the voice said. She heard a boot on the porch step, then another. Then the door handle moved. She had locked it. The bar was down. But the door was old wood, and she was not under any illusion that a locked door was anything more than time. A body hit the door from outside. A deliberate impact, testing it. The frame shuddered. She heard a second body hit it, and this time the frame cracked. She had one clear decision in front of her. She could try to hold the door and lose. It was a matter of seconds. Or she could make clear what was behind the door before they came through it. She took one step back, raised the gun, and fired through the upper panel of the door. The sound inside the house was enormous. It erased everything for a second. The other sounds, her own breathing, all of it. The recoil hit her shoulder, and she was already pulling the second hammer back before the first echo faded. Outside there was a sound. Not a scream, more a yell of pure surprise, which was what she'd been aiming for. Not to hit someone. To make it known. Silence for a moment, Then she heard the voice again, further back from the door now. "She's armed!" He sounded genuinely startled, which told her they hadn't expected it. Good, she thought. Good. She reloaded with hands that were not as steady as they'd been a minute ago, but were still functional. She broke the gun, ejected the shells, loaded two fresh, closed it. She moved to the front window, staying to the side of it, and looked out. Two of the riders had pulled back from the house. She could see horses moving in the yard, but no one directly at the door. To the south, she could hear the ongoing noise of the cattle and could see the fire. It was large now, well established, and she could see the silhouette of riders on the range moving at a pace that meant fighting it, not starting more of it. Nathan and the hands on the range, which meant she was alone here. She went back to the hallway. She did not go to the children's room. She needed to stay between the front of the house and them, not with them. She stood at the end of the hallway where she could see both the front door and the corridor to the back. The riders in the yard were talking to each other. She could hear the low murmur of it through the wall, but not the words. Deciding something. She heard one of them ride away. She tracked the sound east toward the range where the fire was. She heard two of them stay. One of them said something and the other one answered, still low, and then she heard a footfall on the porch boards again. Slow this time. Testing. "Lady," a voice said at the door. Different voice from before. Quieter. "Lady, we're not going to come through that door again. But you're in there alone, aren't you? And we've got time." She said nothing. "Your man is out on the range," the voice continued. "Fire's going to keep him there a while." She kept her eyes on the door and her back against the hallway wall, and she did not speak. "Kane doesn't want to hurt you," the voice said. "He just wants you to come out, you and the kids. Come out and this is done tonight." She thought, "But he doesn't know what I'll do. That's the only advantage I have. He knows I have the gun now, but he doesn't know what I'm capable of. And a man who doesn't know what a person is capable of has to account for more possibilities than one who does. Last thing I want," she said, "is to fire this gun through another piece of this door. But I will." Silence. "You should go," she said, "while you can still choose to." She heard movement on the porch, not coming toward the door, moving sideways along it, which meant they were trying to determine whether there was another way in. There was a window to the left of the door, and she knew the latch on it was weaker than she'd like. She moved before they did. She got to the front room window first, and she stood to the side of it, and when the shape appeared at the glass, a man's face and shoulders, trying to see inside. She was not where he expected her to be. She raised the gun so it was visible through the glass, and she watched the shape freeze. They looked at each other through the window. She held the gun steady. He backed away from the glass. She heard them on the porch for another minute, the footsteps uncertain now, and then she heard them go down the porch steps and into the yard, and the sound of horses moving. Going. Not all the way. She could still hear them at a distance, but back from the house. Regrouping. She stood in the front room and breathed. Her shoulder hurt where the recoil had hit it. She hadn't noticed until now. She pressed the back of her hand against the throb of it and looked out the window at the yard, which was empty. Beyond the yard, the fire on the range was still burning, but she thought it was smaller than it had been. She wanted to believe that anyway. She wasn't certain. She heard hoofbeats coming from the east, fast, and she raised the gun instinctively before she recognized Nathan's horse. He was coming in at a full run, pulling up hard in the yard, and when he got down, he was moving toward the house with a speed that was not his usual pace. She opened the front door before he reached it. He stopped when he saw her. His face was dark with ash, and his coat had a scorched mark on the left arm, and he was breathing hard. He looked at her, and then at the gun, and then at the broken panel in the upper door. "You fired through the door," he said. "Twice," she said. "They had men at the front. I think Kane's riders split, sent some to the range for the cattle, and kept others for the house. They wanted the children." Nathan came up the porch steps and looked at the door up close, and then at her, and she could see in his face the effort of him taking in what had just happened, what she had done, what it meant, what it would have meant if she hadn't. "The children," he said, "under the bed in their room, safe." He let out a breath that had more in it than just air. "Kane's men," she said. "How many were on the range?" 4. 2 ran when they saw we had numbers, 2 didn't." He said this plainly, without elaboration, and she didn't ask for more. "The fire?" "Chet and Dylan have it. It'll burn through the night, but we stopped the worst of it. Lost a section of south fence and maybe 40 head scattered." He put one hand on the door frame, steadying himself or the door or both. "Eliza." She looked at him. Are you all right? She thought about the question honestly. Her shoulder hurt. Her hands were not completely steady now that the immediate crisis had passed. She was in the doorway of a house that had been attacked while her children were under a bed inside it, and the man who had ordered that attack was still 30 miles away in a clean shirt. No, she said, but I'm standing. He looked at her for a long moment in the dim evening light, and she could not entirely name what was in his look. Relief, and something beyond relief, something that had more weight to it, that recognized what she had done and what it had cost her to do it, and was not going to let it go without acknowledgement. The children need to hear your voice, she said. He straightened. Yes. She turned and went back into the house, and he followed her, and she went down the hall to the children's room and knocked on the doorframe twice. It's me, she said. You can come out. A silence, and then Benjamin emerged from under the bed first, because he was 5, and patience was not his strong suit even in emergencies. Clara followed, and when she stood up, her face had the tightly composed look of a child who has been very afraid and very obedient and has now reached the outer limit of both. She looked at her mother. Then she looked at Nathan, who was standing in the doorway behind Eliza. Is it over? Clara said. It was Nathan who answered. For tonight, he said. Yes. Clara looked at him for a moment with that careful, measuring look she had used on him since the beginning. Then she crossed the room, and she put her arms around Eliza from the front and pressed her face against Eliza's chest, and Eliza held her with both arms and felt her daughter shake once, twice, and then go still. Benjamin attached himself to Eliza's side. He had the stone from the nightstand in one hand. They stood like that for a moment, the 4 of them in the small room, and nobody said anything, and outside the night had come down fully, and somewhere to the south Chet and Dylan were fighting the last of the fire. It took 2 hours to get the children settled enough to sleep. Benjamin went down first, the way young children do, the terror and the relief coming close together, and exhaustion doing the rest. Clara took longer. She lay in the dark and asked questions that Eliza answered as honestly as she could without giving her daughter more weight than a 7-year-old needed to carry into sleep. What was going to happen to Cain? Whether the men would come back? Whether Nathan would be there in the morning? Yes, Eliza said to the last one. He'll be here. How do you know? She thought about it. Because this is his ranch and he doesn't leave what he's built, the same way I don't. Clara was quiet for a bit. Then, you shot the door. I did. Were you scared? Very. Did it help, being scared? Eliza considered this. It kept me sharp, she said. I didn't like it, but it helped. Another pause. I was scared under the bed. I know. But I stayed. You did, Eliza said. That was right. You stayed and you kept your brother calm, and that was the right thing. She could hear in the darkness that this landed, not with pleasure exactly, because they were still too close to it for pleasure, but with the particular satisfaction of a child who has done a hard thing and been told so truthfully. Clara slept. Eliza went back to the kitchen. Nathan was at the table with a cup of coffee, which she took as a good sign. A man so shaken he couldn't function wouldn't be drinking coffee. Chet was with him, ash still on his face, his expression doing its usual nothing while conveying considerable. Dylan was at the back door, leaning against the frame. I was young, and the evening had done something to his face that made him look his age and older than his age at the same time. She sat down at the table. Tell me, she said. Nathan looked at Chet. Chet looked at the table. 4 riders on the range, Chet said. They stampeded the herd into the south fence first, then set the fire at the tree line, designed to pull all of us out of the house and onto the range. He paused. Professional work. Not frontier drifters, men who knew what they were doing. Cain hired them from the city, Nathan said. Like my source said, Pueblo and Springs. The 2 that ran, they clear off the property, Eliza said. Far as I can tell, Chet said. We'll check the fence lines at dawn. And the 2 that didn't run, she said. Trespass, destruction of property, cattle theft, Nathan said. I'm writing to the sheriff tomorrow with both names and 3 witnesses. The sheriff who puts things in a drawer. This time I'm also writing to the federal marshal's office in Denver, he said. I was already building the file. What happened tonight is documentation. I have names, I have witnesses, I have a pattern. He paused. And I have a woman who fired through her own front door to keep Cain's men from taking her children, which is something a federal marshal is going to want to hear described. She sat with that. You want me to make a statement? If you're willing. She looked at him. She thought about Kane's face at the auction. She thought about the letter in the ash. She thought about a voice saying your man is out on the range while she stood against a hallway wall with a shotgun and her children under a bed behind her. I'm willing, she said. Nathan looked at her across the table in the kitchen lamplight, with ash on his coat and a scorched mark on his arm, and she thought she was beginning to understand him in a way that was separate from gratitude and separate from the practical arrangement they'd made. This man had paid $500 for a woman and 2 children he didn't know because it was the only thing he could think of to do. And then he had told her the truth when she asked him to, even when the truth was unflattering to him, and then he had come running across the range the moment he could. That was not nothing. She had not decided what it was yet, but it was not nothing. Chet stood up from the table. I'll take the first watch, he said. Send Robbie at midnight. He went out. Dylan followed without being asked, which was the first adult thing she had seen him do. The kitchen was quiet. Nathan looked at the coffee cup. She looked at the wall. Outside, something in the distance, an animal, she thought, maybe a horse, made a sound and then went still. They could have gotten through, she said, if I hadn't had the gun. I know. I should have had it from the first week. You should have, he said. That's on me. I should have made sure you were armed before. I armed myself, she said, 3 days ago. He looked up at her. I didn't tell you, she said. Not because I was hiding it, because it didn't need discussion. I made the decision, and I did it. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. I saw it on the shelf. He almost smiled. You didn't say anything. It was your decision to make, he said, and it was the right one. She stood up from the table and took her cup to the basin and set it down. She was tired in a way that went all the way down, the bone-deep tiredness of sustained fear finally allowed to release. Her shoulder still ached where the recoil had caught her. Get some sleep, she said. You'll need to be clear-headed tomorrow. Eliza. She turned. He was still at the table, and he was looking at her with something in his face that she had not seen there before. Or maybe she had seen it and not let herself name it. It was the look of a man who has been alone with something for a long time and is tired of being alone with it, and who is also afraid of what it means to not be alone with it anymore. What you did tonight, he said, standing in that hallway. What about it? Most people, he stopped, started again. I've known men who would have run, who would have found a window and taken their chances. You didn't run. My children were behind me, she said. Where was I going to go? That's not why, he said quietly. You could have run. The children could have run with you. You chose to hold the house. She looked at him. She didn't have an answer for that, and she was too tired to invent one. This is my home, she said finally. She heard herself say it and heard what it meant, and she thought Nathan heard it too, because something in his face shifted. Quietly, not dramatically, the way light changes when a cloud passes, and you only notice because everything looks slightly different afterward. She turned and went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the night sounds of the ranch. Chet on watch, a horse settling in the inner corral, the distant creak of the range in the wind, and she thought about what she'd said and what she'd meant by it and what it was going to mean for everything that came after. She did not have answers to those questions tonight. Tonight she had, her children asleep, the house standing, the fire dying to the south, the shotgun on the shelf where she'd put it. She had stood her ground in her home. She closed her eyes. The morning after the attack, Raven Hollow Ranch looked like something that had been through a fight and knew it. The south fence line was down in 3 sections. The fire had taken a long wedge of grass along the tree line and left it black and still smoking at the edges in the early light. 2 of the outbuildings near the south corral had scorched walls. The fire had come close but not taken them, which was luck and Chet's speed in equal measure. The inner corrals were intact. The main house was intact, minus the door panel that Eliza had put a shotgun shell through, and the cracked frame where Kane's men had hit it from outside. Eliza was up before dawn. She made coffee and she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the damage as the light came in and let herself see it clearly, because she had learned in the last weeks that seeing things clearly was better than the alternative, even when the alternative was more comfortable. Nathan came down shortly after. He looked like a man who had slept a few hours and had needed more, which was accurate. He accepted coffee and stood beside her at the window without speaking for a moment. The 2 men the marshal's office will want to talk to, she said. Where are they? Chet has them in the barn, tied. He drank the coffee. I sent Dylan to town at first light for the sheriff. Whatever the sheriff does or doesn't do, I want it on record that I reported it. And then Denver. And then Denver. He set down the cup. I'll write out today if I can get the documentation together this morning. It's already together, she said. I added last night's incident to the file before I went to bed. Dates, times, what I heard and saw, the names you gave me from your source. It's in the supply room. He turned to look at her. You did that last night, he said. It needed to be done, she said, and I wasn't sleeping anyway. He held her gaze for a moment with that look, the one she was beginning to recognize as Nathan's version of something he couldn't quite say, a feeling that came to the surface of his face without making it all the way into words. Then he went to get the file. The sheriff arrived with Dylan in late morning, a heavy-set man named Purvis, who had the careful, uninvested manner of someone who had made a career of managing situations from the minimum safe distance. He looked at the fence and the scorched tree line and the door and the two men in Chet's barn, and he wrote things in a notebook with the deliberate pace of a man who is being thorough and has no intention of being effective. He interviewed Eliza in the kitchen. She told him what had happened, in sequence, without editorializing. She told him about the voice at the door, about firing through the upper panel, about the two men at the front window, about the riders on the range. Purvis wrote. He asked a few questions that were the questions a man asks when he is compiling a report rather than investigating a crime. Can you positively identify the men in the barn as the same men who were at your door? He asked. It was dusk, she said. I didn't see their faces clearly. So you can't confirm they were the ones at the house. I can confirm that Kane's men attacked this ranch last night. I can confirm there were riders at the front of the house and riders on the range simultaneously, which means there were at least 5 or 6 of them, and 2 of them are currently in your custody in that barn. I can confirm that Nathan Cole has documentation connecting Kane's operations to systematic interference with this ranch going back 6 weeks, Purvis wrote. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, in the tone of a man choosing his next words carefully. Victor Kane is a prominent member of this county's commerce community. He hired men to come to my home while my children were inside it, she said. Her voice was flat. I fired a weapon to keep them from coming through my door. That is what happened here, Sheriff. You can write whatever you want in that notebook, but that is what happened. Purvis looked at her over the notebook. Then he looked down and wrote something. He left with the 2 men from the barn and his notebook, and he did not make any promises. She watched him go from the porch. Chet appeared beside her. Well, he said. Yes, she said. Nathan left for Denver that afternoon with the full documentation file and a letter from Eliza that she had written at the kitchen table in the 2 hours between the sheriff's departure and Nathan's. The letter was her account of the attack, signed and dated, written in the careful hand she'd developed in the years when Martin's accounts had been hers to manage, before she'd known about the other accounts, the ones she hadn't been allowed to see. She gave it to Nathan at the horse, and he read it standing there, and when he finished, he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, close. This is good, he said, clear and specific. You'll want to give that directly to the marshal, she said, not through an intermediary. I know. He gathered the reins. Chet's in charge while I'm gone. 2 days, maybe 3. We'll be fine. I know you will. He paused with his foot in the stirrup. There was something he was working out. She could see it, the slight tension of a man deciding something. Then he said, When I get back, I want to talk to you about what comes next. Not the legal situation, about the rest of it. She looked at him. The morning light was direct and he was squinting slightly against it, and he looked like what he was, a tired, careful man who had done the right thing repeatedly without making it look easy, and who was now trying to say something that didn't come easily to him. All right, she said, when you get back. He rode out. She stood in the yard and watched him go, and then she turned and went back to work, because the ranch didn't pause for legal crises or unspoken conversations, and it needed running. The 2 days Nathan was gone had a particular quality that Eliza would later think of as the pause between one thing and another. The immediate crisis had passed, but nothing was settled. Kane was still in Caldwell Creek. The federal filing was pending. The south fence needed rebuilding. The cattle that had scattered in the stampede needed finding. Chet and 2 of the hands spent both days on the range recovering them, and by the end of the second day they had 34 of the 40 back and were still short 6 head. Eliza kept the household running, and she kept the shotgun on the shelf. She also, in the mornings before the children were up, sat at the kitchen table with the supply ledger and worked through something she had been thinking about for days. the ranch's resource planning for the coming months. It had started as an extension of the account work she'd been doing since she arrived, but it had grown into something more systematic, an analysis of where the operation was efficient and where it was bleeding unnecessarily, and what adjustments would make a material difference to the margins. She wrote it in the same clear hand as the letter to the marshal, and when she was done, she had 4 pages. She wasn't sure what to do with the 4 pages. It wasn't exactly her business to be advising Nathan on his ranch operations, except that she had been managing those operations for over a month, and the numbers were visible to her, and the patterns were clear, and not saying anything about clear patterns was its own kind of choice. She left the 4 pages on the kitchen table with a pen on top of them and waited to see if Nathan noticed them when he got back. He got back on the evening of the 3rd day, later than he'd said, which meant something had taken longer than expected. He came in looking like a man who had ridden hard and handled a great deal of information in a short time. He sat down in the kitchen, and she put food in front of him, and he ate it, and when he was done, he told her what had happened in Denver. The federal marshal had received the documentation. He had read the file, the whole file, including Eliza's letter, and he had taken it seriously in a way that Sheriff Purvis had not. The pattern of events was consistent with what the marshal's office had been watching in other counties: land consolidation through legal pressure and coordinated harassment, a tactic that stopped just short of obvious criminality until it didn't. Kane's name was not unknown to them. The marshal had assigned a deputy to the case. That deputy would arrive in the county within 2 weeks to conduct interviews and review the county land records. The debt claim, Kane's counterfiling, had been examined by the federal office's legal counsel, who had an opinion. It was not frivolous, but it was built on a procedural argument that was unlikely to survive a federal judge's scrutiny, particularly given that the original auction's legal basis was itself questionable. The counsel's word was questionable, not invalid, which was not the same as good news but was better than the alternative. "It's not over," Nathan said. "Kane will fight the federal review. He has lawyers and money, and he knows how to slow things down." "But he knows now that it's federal," she said. "He knows. Which changes his options. He can't send men to the ranch again. One attack is leverage. A second is a federal crime with witnesses already on record." Nathan looked at the table. "He'll work the legal side now. It'll be slower and it'll cost money, but it's the right fight to be in." She thought about this. How long? Could be months. Could be most of a year. And the water rights. The federal council flagged those too. The holding company structure Kane used to file the challenge is exactly the kind of thing the marshal's office looks at. He paused. "It's not resolved, but it's visible now to people who can do something about it." She sat with that for a moment. Months. A year. The kind of timeline that required a person to settle into a life rather than camping at the edge of one, waiting to find out whether it would hold. She pushed the 4 pages across the table. Nathan looked at them. He picked them up and started reading, and she refilled her coffee and didn't watch him read, because it felt overly pointed to watch. He read for a while. She heard him turn the 2nd page. The 3rd. "The supply ordering from the merchant in town," he said. "You're paying above market rate for grain and dry goods. There's a cooperative out of Gilmore County that 3 ranches on the Eastern Range use together. Their collective rate is 18% lower. I'd have to build a relationship with the cooperative. I know, it takes a season, but the math is clear." She set down her cup. "The bunkhouse food budget also. Chet's a good man and a good foreman, but he doesn't manage supply costs because that's not his job. With someone tracking it, you'd save $30 a quarter without cutting anything the men actually need. You've been doing this," he said, still looking at the pages. "This whole time." "I've been doing the accounts. This came out of the accounts." "This is more than accounts." She looked at him steadily. "I know what I'm doing, Nathan. I knew before I came here, and I know more now." He set the pages down. He looked at her across the table, and the kitchen lamp was between them, and the light it threw was warm and uneven, and he had ash still in his hairline from the day before he left, and he hadn't noticed, and the 4 pages were on the table between them. "When I get back, I want to talk about what comes next," he had said. "Not the legal situation." She waited. He said, "I don't know how to do this well." "Do what?" He gestured vaguely at the space between them and then dropped his hand. "Say what I mean." "Try," she said. He looked at the lamp. "When I came back from Denver this evening and I rode up the main road, I saw the kitchen light." He paused. "I've ridden up that road for 7 years, coming back from town, from Denver, from wherever. The house has always been dark. I keep the hands in the bunkhouse. I don't ask them to leave a lamp on. The house has just been dark when I come back." He stopped. She didn't fill the silence. "The kitchen light was on," he said, "and I could see it from the bend in the road. And I—" He stopped again and made a small sound that was not quite anything. That was the first time in a long time that coming back meant coming back to something. The kitchen was quiet. From the back of the house, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the ranch settling into night. "Nathan," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. What you do here, how long you stay, what you decide, all of that is yours. I bought a debt. You don't owe me. I know what I owe you," she said. $1.50 a week, which you have not actually collected since I arrived." He stopped. "You forgot," she said. "Twice I reminded you, and you said you'd get to it, and you didn't." Something crossed his face that was not quite embarrassment, but was adjacent to it. "Nathan," she said again more gently, "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. "I said it the night of the attack," she said. "This is my home. I meant it. I didn't mean it because I was scared, or because I was grateful, or because I didn't have anywhere else to go. I meant it because I've been here 6 weeks, and I have built something here that is mine, and my children have built something here that is theirs, and I am not in the habit of walking away from things I've built." He was very still. "What I don't know," she said, "is what you want. That's what you were trying to say, I think." He looked at the table and then at her, and it cost him something to say it plainly. She could see that, but he said it. "I want you to stay, not as my housekeeper." She held his gaze. "Say it clearly." "I want—" He pressed his mouth together once and tried again. "I want this to be real. The 4 of us. The ranch. I want to ask you to marry me, and I want to ask if I can raise your children as my own. That's what I want." He said the last part quickly, like a man getting a difficult thing out before he can reconsider. I know how that sounds when I say it out loud, and I know we've been here 6 weeks, and I know you've had enough of men making decisions about your life." "You're not making a decision," she said. "You're asking." He stopped. "That's different," she said. A pause. "Is it something you'd consider?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Martin, not with anger now, not with the grief that had been so sharp in the early weeks, but with the particular clarity you develop when enough time has passed to see a thing whole. Martin had been a man who kept things from her, and had believed he was protecting her by doing it, and that belief had been wrong, and the cost of it had been paid by both of them, and eventually by their children. She had loved him, and she had not known him as fully as she'd believed. She thought about Nathan, a man who made mistakes and named them, who kept information from her once and corrected it when she called him on it, who had told Chet to look at the ceiling and had let her contradict him, and had not once, in 6 weeks, given her a reason to believe that what he showed her was different from what he was. She thought about the kitchen light in the bend of the road, and what it had meant to him to see it. "Yes," she said, "it's something I'd consider." He let out a breath. "But not tonight," she said. "You've been in a saddle for 3 days, and I've been running this ranch without you, and we're both exhausted, and decisions about the rest of your life shouldn't be made when you're exhausted." He looked at her, and the thing at the corner of his mouth happened. Not quite a smile, closer than usual. "That's practical," he said. "I'm a practical person," she said. "You knew that." "I did," he said. "From the supply ledger." She stood up from the table and took the 4 pages with her and set them on the counter where they'd be easy to find. "Sleep," she said. "We'll talk tomorrow." He slept. She went to her room and lay awake for a while in the good way. Not the wakeful anxiety of the early weeks, but the wakeful thinking of a person who has something specific to think about. She thought about it carefully and honestly, and without sentimentality, which was the only way she trusted herself to think about large things. When she slept well. The conversation happened the next morning, after the children were fed, and Clara had taken Benjamin outside to the barn to visit the bay mare, which had become the morning routine. Eliza and Nathan sat at the kitchen table with coffee and no performance of formality, because they were past formality, and both of them knew it. She told him what she needed. She said it plainly, the way he had tried the night before and had mostly managed. She needed the legal situation resolved before she made any formal decision. Not because she doubted him, but because she had spent 4 years inside a marriage where the ground had been unsteady without her knowing it, and she would not step into a new situation while the ground was still actively contested. She needed to know what they were building on. He agreed to that without argument. She told him she needed the children to come to it themselves, not to be told, not to have the situation explained to them in the way adults sometimes explain things to children as a courtesy while having already decided. She needed Clara to have the time and the space to make her own determination about Nathan Cole, because Clara was 7 and already knew too much about what happened when adults made decisions that affected her without including her. He said, "What about Benjamin?" "Benjamin," she said, "would follow that horse into a river if Chet let him. He's already decided about this place. But Clara is different." He nodded. "Then we let her be different." She told him, because she thought he should know, that she had been afraid to trust this, that she had spent the first weeks here watching for the moment when what he presented would break and something else would come through, because that was what her experience had taught her to expect, and it hadn't broken, and that she had had to consciously decide to let that mean something rather than keep waiting for the break. She said this without apology, but also without comfort, just as information, the way she gave him other information. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I should tell you something too." She waited. "When I came to the auction," he said, "I told you it was the only thing I could think of. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I'd seen you in town, not just at the Callaway gathering, a few times before that, over a year or more. You were always with your husband and your children, and that was just what it was. But I'd noticed you." He looked up. "I want you to know that because I don't want you to think the auction was purely an impulse. There was something behind it that wasn't just practical." She held his gaze. "You could have said that earlier." "I didn't know how it would land," he said, "given that I was also your employer." She thought about it. "It lands fine," she said. "Thank you for saying it." He nodded once. They finished their coffee. The following weeks had a different quality from everything that had come before. The legal situation was still unresolved. The federal deputy arrived 10 days after Nathan's Denver trip, a serious man named Aldrich who interviewed everyone on the ranch, including Eliza, and spent 3 days in the county land records office before riding out without telling anyone what he'd found. The water rights challenge was still on the county docket. Kane had not communicated directly since his visit to the ranch, which was either a good sign or a sign that he was operating through channels too quiet to see. But inside all of that, something had settled. Not perfectly. There was no such thing as perfect in a household with 2 children and 6 ranch hands and 600 head of cattle and a frontier winter beginning to suggest itself in the evening temperatures. There were days when the accounts didn't balance, and days when the south fence needed mending again, and days when Benjamin was difficult, and Clara was quiet in the way that meant she was processing something she hadn't found words for yet. There were evenings when Eliza was so tired that she sat down at the kitchen table after supper and couldn't immediately remember what she'd been about to do next. But the house was warm and the work was hers, and her children were safe. And the man across the table from her at most meals was one she trusted, which was not a small thing. It was, she was learning, actually an enormous thing, so large that she hadn't understood its size when she didn't have it. It was Clara who moved first, which was not what Eliza had expected. It happened on a Saturday, about 3 weeks after Nathan had asked his not-quite question at the kitchen table. Eliza was in the supply room working on the cooperative arrangement for the grain order. She had written the first letter to the Gilmore County Cooperative that week, and the response had come back favorable. When she heard Clara's voice from the main room and then Nathan's, and the quality of the exchange made her go still and listen. She couldn't hear the words, just the rhythm. Clara's voice asking something, Nathan's answering at some length, Clara asking again. Not tense, not the careful, watchful tone Clara had used with Nathan for the first 2 months. Something different, something that had relaxed without announcing that it was relaxing. She did not go out to listen more closely. It was their conversation, not hers. She went back to the cooperative letter. An hour later, Clara appeared in the supply room doorway with flour on her hands, which meant she'd been in the kitchen and had clearly had a reason to be in the kitchen. Nathan says you've been writing letters about the grain, Clara said. I have. He said it was your idea, the cooperative. It was. Clara considered this in that particular way she had, taking information in, turning it, checking it against what she already knew. He said it was a good idea. It is a good idea. He seemed like he meant it. She wiped the flour on her dress, which she always did despite Eliza's ongoing effort to redirect this habit toward an actual cloth. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean, does he? Eliza looked at her daughter. Not that I've seen. Clara nodded, the nod of someone filing something in a particular place. He was telling me about the horses, she said. The mare. Her name was Cora. The one he had before. Not the bay. The one that died. She paused. He doesn't talk about that stuff usually. No, Eliza said. He doesn't. He told me about his wife, too. Clara's voice was careful. And his son. Eliza kept her expression still. Nathan had told Clara about his family. She hadn't suggested it. He had done it himself, in a conversation she hadn't been part of. And the fact that he had opened that particular room for a 7-year-old who needed to know what kind of man she was dealing with settled something in her that she hadn't known was still unsettled. What did he say? She asked. That they were people he loved, Clara said, and that losing them changed what kind of man he was. But not in a way that meant he couldn't. She stopped, working on the phrase. He said he didn't think he was done being a family, even after. Eliza said nothing. I think he was telling me something, Clara said, with the directness of a child who has decided to name what she sees. I think he probably was, Eliza said. Clara looked at her. What are you going to do? I'm going to finish this letter, Eliza said, and then I'm going to start supper, and we're going to see how things go. Clara made a face that said this was not a complete answer. Eliza made one back that said it was the answer available. Mom, Clara said. What? I think it would be okay, Clara said, if things went that way. She said it carefully, like she was testing the weight of the words. I think it would be okay. Eliza looked at her daughter. She thought about the platform, Clara's hand going white-knuckled in hers. She thought about the laughter through the screen door, the first real one in 3 weeks. She thought about a 7-year-old under a bed in the dark, holding her brother's hand and not making a sound, and coming out of it with her dignity intact and her mother's trust earned. Thank you for telling me, she said. Clara went back to the kitchen, trailing flour. The conversation Eliza had been waiting to have with Nathan happened on a Wednesday evening in the 6th week after his return from Denver, and it happened without either of them planning it. She had been sitting on the porch after the children were down, and Nathan came out and sat in the other chair, the way he had developed the habit of doing, and they talked about the cooperative letter. The response had confirmed a first shipment at the reduced rate, which meant a saving that was real and provable. And then they talked about the south fence, which had been fully rebuilt and reinforced, and then they were quiet for a while in the way they were sometimes quiet, and then she said it. I've been thinking about what you asked, she said. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. What have you been thinking? That yes is the answer, she said, if you still want to ask. He turned to look at her. In the dark of the porch, she could see the outline of his face and the particular quality of his stillness when something mattered. I still want to ask, he said. Then ask. He shifted in the chair and faced her, and he asked, plainly, without embellishment, the way he did most things. Would she marry him? Would she let him build a life with her and raise her children as his own? Would she stay at Raven Hollow not as a housekeeper or a woman who owed a debt, but as the person who lived here alongside him, because that was what he wanted, and he was saying so directly? She said yes. He reached across and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the porch for a while after that without feeling the need to say much more about it, because the main thing had been said, and the rest would take time, and time was what they now had. She would tell the children in the morning. She had already, she thought, told Clara without knowing it, and Clara had already answered. Inside the house, from the children's room, she heard Benjamin talking in his sleep. Not words, just sounds, the particular murmur of a young child working through something in a dream. She heard him settle, then quiet. She sat on the porch of her home with her hand in Nathan Cole's, and she did not try to think too far ahead. Not the legal outcome, not the winter coming, not the shape of years she couldn't yet see. She stayed in the specific present tense of the moment, the night sounds, the cooling air, the distant light of a lamp. Dylan had left burning in the bunkhouse. She had been sold in a public square less than 2 months ago. She had been reduced to a number by a man who collected things. She had stood on a platform in the heat, with her children's hands in hers, and no path forward visible in any direction. She had not made a single perfect decision since. She had made practical ones, and honest ones, and a few she'd had to correct, and one she'd made through a closed door with a shotgun. None of it had been smooth, and none of it had resolved cleanly, and the man whose hand she was holding right now was difficult to know and slow to speak, and had made at least two significant errors in judgment that she was aware of, and probably more that she wasn't. And still, the thing that had sustained her through the auction and the first week and the letter and Kane's visit and the night of the attack was not the hope of this. She hadn't let herself hope for this. It had been too far away to see. What had sustained her was simpler: the decision, made on a jailhouse floor the morning of the auction, to keep her promise, to hold on to what she had. She had held on. What she had now was more than she'd held on to. It was more than she had permitted herself to imagine. She didn't say that out loud. She kept it for herself. In the same place she kept other things that were true and complete and didn't need to be said to anyone to be real. Nathan's thumb moved once across her hand. She tightened her grip slightly. They stayed on the porch until the chill came in off the mountains, and then they went inside. And the house was warm and her children were sleeping, and the lamp in the kitchen was lit, visible from the bend in the road. The letter from the federal marshal's office arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the first real cold had come down off the mountains and the ranch was running on the compressed, purposeful energy of a place preparing for winter. Eliza was at the kitchen table with the account ledger when Nathan brought it in from the road. He set it in front of her without opening it, which told her something. He wanted her present when it was read, not to receive a summary of it afterward. She had noticed this about him in the past weeks, the way he had begun to include her in things as a matter of course rather than a deliberate gesture. It happened without announcement. She had decided that was how it should happen. She opened the letter. It was 4 pages, dense with the formal language of legal proceedings, and she read it through once quickly and then again slowly, the way she read anything important. The first time for the shape of it, the second time for the specific weight of each part. The federal deputy's investigation had concluded. The U.S. Marshal's Office had filed a formal complaint against Victor Kane, his lawyer Burwell, and the land holding company operating under the Denver P.O. Box on 3 counts: coordinated interference with private land and livestock rights, fraudulent legal filing intended to obstruct a lawful private debt settlement, and conspiracy to intimidate through organized trespass and destruction of property. The 2 men recovered from the ranch the night of the attack had provided statements. Apparently the prospect of federal charges against hired hands, when the man who hired them faced charges of his own, had been clarifying. The water rights challenge had been dismissed by the county court pending a federal review of the holding company's legal standing. That review had been initiated. Kane's debt counterclaim had been ruled procedurally invalid by a federal judge in Denver. The original debt was discharged. Eliza Hartwell owed nothing to Victor Kane or any entity connected to him. She set the letter down. Nathan was watching her from across the table. "The water rights," she said. "The dismissal holds until the federal review is done," he said. "Could take another 6 months, but the challenge is on hold. And Kane faces federal prosecution. Burwell, too." He paused. "He'll have lawyers. It won't be fast, but it's federal. He can't buy his way around it the way he bought the county sheriff." She thought about Kane's face at the auction. The smile. The grin that said he already knew how the story ended. The story had ended differently than he'd planned. She thought about what it would be appropriate to feel in this moment. Relief, certainly. And she did feel it. A real and physical loosening of something that had been tight in her chest for months. But relief alone wasn't the whole of it, because relief implied that the danger had been the central thing, and she didn't think the danger had been the central thing. The danger had been the frame. Inside the frame, other things had been built. The danger being resolved didn't diminish those things. If anything, it made them more visible. "It's done," she said. "The legal part, yes. The rest of it." He looked at the letter. "The ranch has work ahead. Rebuilding the South Range properly, the winter stores, the cooperative arrangement. It's not a clear horizon, it's just a clearer one." She appreciated that he didn't dress it up. She had always appreciated that. "A clearer one is enough," she said. She told the children that evening, after supper, in the plain way she had told them things throughout, not dramatizing, not softening beyond what was true. She told them that the legal situation with the man who had caused problems for the ranch had been resolved by the federal court, and that they were safe, and that things were going to be stable. Benjamin processed this for approximately 4 seconds, and then asked whether Chet would let him ride the bay mare now that things were stable. Clara listened to the full explanation and then sat with it for a moment the way she always sat with important information, giving it the respect of actual consideration. "He can't come back," she said. "Kane?" "No," Eliza said. "He has his own problems now." Clara nodded. "Good," she said, with the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of a child whose sense of justice is not yet muddied by the complexities that come with age. Eliza envied it slightly. She also knew it was right. It was good, straightforwardly, without qualification. Good, she agreed. The wedding happened in November, a month after the letter. Eliza had not wanted a large event. She had been through one public proceeding in Caldwell Creek that had been witnessed by half the town, and she had no interest in repeating the dynamic of her life being observed and assessed by a crowd of people who had not chosen her well the first time. Nathan had agreed without argument. He was not a man who wanted events. He wanted things done. They were married by the county judge in Caldwell Creek on a Friday morning with Chet and Dylan as witnesses, and the children standing beside them in the courthouse room that smelled of old paper and floor wax. Clara was wearing her good dress. Benjamin had his stone in his pocket, the flat one from the water trough, which he had appointed as a general good luck object and brought everywhere. The judge read the ceremony in the brisk manner of a man who had performed it many times and found its efficiency suitable. Nathan said what he was required to say without elaboration. Eliza said what she was required to say with the full weight of what she meant. When it was done, Chet shook Nathan's hand and gave Eliza a look that communicated something specific in his particular economy of expression. Something like, "This is correct, and I approve, and I am not going to say any of that, so take the look as given." She did. Dylan had the expression of a young man who was genuinely moved and was trying to appear less moved than he was, which she found touching. Benjamin asked if they could have cake. They had cake at the small restaurant 3 doors down from the courthouse, at a table in the back with no one they didn't want present. The cake was not exceptional, but it was real, and it was shared, and Benjamin ate 2 pieces without asking permission, which Eliza noted and decided to address another day. Clara sat next to Nathan during the meal, not pressed against him, not with the deliberate closeness of a child performing affection, but the natural proximity of someone who has decided they are comfortable where they are. She asked him, at some point during the second cup of coffee, whether he was going to keep calling her Clara or whether that was going to change. Nathan looked at her. Why would it change? Some men call girls little one, or darling, Clara said, with the precise disdain of a 7-year-old who has opinions. I don't like that. Clara it is, Nathan said. And Benjamin doesn't like boy, she said. I know his name, Nathan said. Clara appeared satisfied by this. She went back to her cake. Eliza caught Nathan's eye across the table. He made a small movement at the corner of his mouth. She looked away before she smiled, because she was not quite ready to smile openly at him yet, in the full, uncomplicated way, and she was not sure she needed to explain that to herself or to him. There were things that took time. That was simply true. A person could be certain of a choice and still need time to inhabit it fully, and rushing that process was a kind of dishonesty toward it. She was certain. She was in the process of becoming fully present in the certainty. That was not a contradiction. The winter came to Raven Hollow Ranch in the particular way that Colorado winters come to high frontier land. Not gradually, but with intention, a hard freeze in November and then a series of snowstorms in December that kept everyone close to the buildings for days at a time. The work of the ranch did not stop for snow. It adapted, which was a different thing. Eliza adapted alongside it. She had grown up with winters, though not quite winters like this. Frontier cold had a quality different from what she'd known. Something more absolute, less negotiated. The supply work she'd done in the fall months meant the ranch was well stocked, the cooperative grain delivery having arrived in October at the reduced rate. The pantry organized to a system that meant she could find anything in the dark. When the first big storm came and kept the hands in the bunkhouse for 2 days, the house was warm and fed, and the children were not frightened by the sound of it. Nathan and Eliza developed the winter routines that a working household develops. Who rose first? Who built the morning fire? Who managed the account work in the abbreviated afternoons? Who took which evenings with the children? These were not negotiated formally. They settled into shape through the ordinary attrition of days, each person doing what was needed, the shape of it becoming familiar without being prescribed. He was not an easy man to live with, she discovered, not in the ways she'd feared before the marriage. He was not harsh, not controlling, not the kind of man who expected things to be a particular way and made the household aware of his displeasure when they weren't. But he was quiet in ways that were sometimes hard to read, and he carried things internally for longer than was useful, and there were evenings when something from the day was clearly sitting in him, and she didn't know what it was, and he didn't offer it. The first time this happened, she waited. The second time she waited, and then, when he still hadn't said anything by the third day, she said, "What's in your head?" He looked up from the table. "You've been carrying something for 3 days," she said. "You're not talking about it. That's your business, and I'll respect it if you tell me it's your business. But if you're carrying it and it's affecting the household, and you just haven't thought to say anything, that's different." He looked at her for a moment. Then he told her. A letter from a neighboring rancher proposing a boundary survey that had implications for the North Creek. He'd been trying to determine whether it was a straightforward proposal or a first move in a new version of what Kane had attempted, and he hadn't wanted to bring it to her before he'd figured out which it was. "That's exactly the kind of thing I should know about immediately," she said. "I didn't want to worry you before I knew what it was." "Don't manage my worry," she said. "Let me help figure out what it is." He accepted this. He didn't do it perfectly. There were other times, other things he carried longer than he should have before bringing them out. But he was learning, which was all she'd asked, and she was learning the particular rhythms of his quietness well enough to read the difference between the quietness that was nothing and the quietness that was something. That too was a kind of communication, even if it was a frustrating one. She had her own version of the same fault. She managed things internally to a degree that was sometimes excessive, ran calculations in her head about situations without sharing them, came to conclusions about the household that she acted on without explaining her reasoning, which occasionally produced results that Nathan had to learn rather than anticipate. He called her on it once, politely but directly. "You've already decided about the spring planting rotation. I don't know why yet." "I can explain it," she said. "That would be good," he said. She explained it. He asked 2 questions that were actually useful. The rotation was better after the conversation than before it. She filed that. Marriage, she was saying, was less about compatibility than about the sustained willingness to understand another person. Not once, not at the beginning when everything was still interesting, but continuously, on the days when understanding required effort that you didn't have, when the person across from you was difficult to read and you were tired, and it would be easier to just let it go. It was not a romantic discovery. It was a practical one, and it seemed more durable for being practical. The federal case against Kane proceeded through the winter, arriving in the form of occasional correspondence from the marshal's office that Nathan read and filed and discussed with Eliza in the evenings. Kane had retained a lawyer from Denver, a prominent one, not Burwell, who had his own legal problems, and was contesting the charges on procedural grounds. This was expected and not alarming. The marshal's deputy had written that the evidence package was strong and that procedural delays were Kane's best available strategy, rather than a sign of weakness in the government's position. The 2 hired men had cooperated fully in exchange for reduced charges. Their statements confirmed everything: Kane's planning, the fire as deliberate distraction, the explicit instructions to bring Eliza and the children to Kane directly. That last part, the instructions to bring the children, had been included in the federal complaint specifically, and the marshal had noted in his correspondence that it was the element most likely to determine the severity of the sentencing. In February, a piece of news came through a rancher who'd been to Caldwell Creek for supplies. Kane had quietly sold the saloon and the gaming hall. Not voluntarily. A condition of his bail arrangement was that he divest from businesses considered to have funded the illegal activity. The buildings had gone to a buyer from Colorado Springs. The new owner had no connection to Kane. Eliza heard this from Nathan and sat with it for a moment. "The man who owned half the town," she said. "He owns a house and a legal problem now," Nathan said. She thought about the auction square, the crowd that had watched and said nothing, the women in bonnets along the far side who wouldn't meet her eyes. She had carried a kind of quiet anger about that crowd for months. Not a burning anger, but a low, steady one, the anger of a person who has been reduced publicly by people who let it happen. The anger had not gone away exactly, but it had changed in quality, the way things change when they no longer need to be carried urgently. It had become something more like understanding. People in that crowd had been afraid of Kane, afraid of their own precarious positions, afraid of the price of standing up to a man who controlled so much of what they depended on. She knew about that fear now in a way she hadn't before the auction, because she had felt it herself, standing in a hallway with a shotgun and the full awareness of what she was responsible for. Fear was not nothing. Fear was real, and it was present, and it made people into versions of themselves they didn't want to be. She could be angry at the crowd and understand them at the same time. She decided to do both, and to let the understanding be the larger of the two. Spring came to the ranch the way it always did on that land, with mud and noise and the particular urgency of everything needing to be done at once after months of compressed waiting. The cooperative grain arrangement had been fully established, and a third rancher from the eastern range had joined, which brought the collective rate lower still. The south fence line was rebuilt properly, with better post depth and a new gate that Chet had designed himself and was quietly proud of without saying so. The cattle count was up. They'd recovered the scattered 6 head from the fall, one of them showing up at the fence of a neighboring property in December where they'd been boarding as a stray, and the spring calves were numerous and healthy. Nathan tracked them with the focused attention of a man whose relationship with the land was not abstract but direct, personal. The relationship of someone who had been working a specific piece of earth for long enough that its particular patterns and tendencies were written into his understanding of things. Benjamin turned 6 in March. He had been riding the bay mare under supervision since February, first in the inner corral with Chet walking beside, and then, when Chet judged the time right, in wider circles in the outer corral alone. I was not a natural rider in the technical sense. He sat a little awkwardly, and his hands were inconsistent, but he had no fear, and the horse responded to his confidence in a way that partially compensated for the technique. Chet watched these sessions from the fence rail with an expression that consistently communicated nothing while communicating something. For Benjamin's birthday, Nathan came to breakfast and set something on the table in front of him. It was a bridle, cleaned and oiled, not new but well kept, sized for a child. Benjamin looked at it. "That was mine," Nathan said. "When I learned." Benjamin picked up the bridle carefully, the way he picked up things he understood to be important. He turned it in his hands. He looked at Nathan with an expression that was trying to contain more than his 6-year-old face had space for. "Does this mean I'm really learning?" he said. "You've been learning," Nathan said. "This means I think you're ready for more of it." Benjamin set the bridle down on the table and stood up and put his arms around Nathan's waist, briefly and with the total sincerity of a young child, and then sat back down and looked at the bridle again. Nathan's hand had come up during the embrace and settled, briefly, on the back of Benjamin's head. When Benjamin sat down, Nathan looked across the table at Eliza. She held his gaze for a moment. There were no words that would have been right for that moment, so she didn't say any, and neither did he, and it was the correct decision. Clara had grown in ways that were visible and ways that were not. She was 8 now, coming up on 9, and she had developed in the past year the particular quality of a child who has been through something and has not been diminished by it but deepened. She helped in the kitchen with real competence, not child helping but actual assistance. She could manage the bread without supervision and had a feel for seasoning that was better than she had any right to have at her age. She read every book in the house and had started, through correspondence arranged by Nathan, with a contact in Denver, receiving a small monthly selection of new ones. She had not stopped watching. The watchfulness that had been anxiety in the beginning had become something else. A quality of attention that was curious rather than fearful. The paying close attention of a person who finds the world genuinely interesting and wants to understand it rather than just get through it. She asked Nathan questions that nobody else thought to ask. At supper one evening, she asked him how he had learned to manage a ranch of this size. He said he'd made a great many mistakes and paid attention to them. She asked what the most important mistake had been. He thought about it for a long enough time that Eliza, who had heard him answer questions quickly when he had quick answers, understood he was giving this one actual consideration. "I used to think that handling things alone was the same as handling them well," he said finally. "It's not." Clara wrote something in the small notebook she had started carrying. "What are you writing?" Benjamin asked. "Things worth remembering," Clara said. "Like what?" "Like that," she said. Eliza looked at her daughter and thought about a woman who had spent 9 years in a marriage to a man who had handled things alone and believed it was handling them well, and about the cost of that belief, and about the child across the table who was writing it down at 8 years old. There were moments in the life they were building that were not peaceful, moments when old things surfaced, when the weight of the past 2 years pressed through the daily routine and demanded to be felt. There was a night in April when a thunderstorm came through with a violence that woke the household, and Eliza, in the half-second before she was fully awake, felt the particular fear of the night of the attack, the fire, the riders, the voice at the door. And it was several breaths before the present reasserted itself. She lay in the dark and breathed until she was fully in April and not in October, and it took longer than she would have liked. She told Nathan the next morning. She told him because not telling him would have been the old habit, the management of things alone, and she had identified that habit in herself and decided against it. He listened and then said, "Does it happen often?" "Not often. Sometimes." "What helps?" She thought about it. Being where I actually am, she said. Specifically, this room, this morning, the particular things about right now. He nodded. Tell me when it happens, if that helps. It might, she said. Then tell me. She told him the next time it happened, and the time after that, and it did help. Not because being told made Nathan able to do anything, but because saying it out loud to a specific person in a specific room was its own form of being where you actually were. He had his own version of it. She came to understand, over the months, that the creak of a particular floorboard in the hallway near the children's room had some connection to the way the fever had moved through his family 7 years ago. A night sound, a thing heard from a hallway. He didn't talk about it at length, but she knew it was there, and knowing it was there meant that when he was up late on a night when nothing required it, she understood without asking, and she put the coffee on, and they sat in the kitchen and talked about ordinary things until the night was ordinary again. They were each other's particular knowledge. That was what marriage was, she thought. Not the ceremony, not the legal document, not even the shared roof. It was the accumulated specific knowledge of another person. What they needed when they needed it, what they couldn't ask for when they needed it most, what they were capable of that even they didn't fully know. The Kane case concluded in July. He pled to 2 of the 3 federal charges: interference with land and livestock rights and fraudulent legal filing, in exchange for the conspiracy charge being reduced. The sentence was 3 years, the first year of which was to be served, the remainder suspended on conditions that included permanent divestiture from all property and business interests in the county and a formal prohibition on any contact with Eliza Cole or her family. The name in the document was Eliza Cole. She noticed that. The water rights challenge was permanently dismissed with the conclusion of the federal case. The North Creek belonged to Raven Hollow Ranch, with a clarity that was now on federal record. She read the final correspondence on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week as the first letter, which she noticed and considered symmetrical without being particularly moved by it. What she was moved by was simpler. It was finished. The thing that had started at an auction platform in the July heat of 1875 had a legal conclusion now, documented and permanent, and the man who had stood on that platform with his grin and his belief that he already knew how the story ended had been wrong. She put the letter in the file where she kept the ranch's important documents. Not Kane's file, not a special designation, just the file where things that needed to be kept were kept. It belonged there. It was part of the ranch's history, and therefore part of hers. That evening, Nathan found her on the porch when he came in from the range. She was sitting in her chair watching the light come off the mountains to the east, the particular orange of a late summer Colorado sunset that she had learned over the course of a year to recognize as specific to this land at this hour. He sat in his chair. "It's done," she said. "Yes." They sat with that for a moment. "Clara asked me today whether we could get another dog," she said. He looked over at her. "We don't have a dog." "I know. She said she thought a ranch this size should have one." "She's probably right," he said. "She usually is," Eliza said. He made the sound. She had come to understand over the past year that the sound meant something specific. It was Nathan's version of laughter, compressed into something smaller because he was a man who had spent years keeping himself compressed, and old habits are stubborn, but it was real, and it was his, and she had decided it was one of the things she was most fond of without having expected to be fond of it. The porch had become their place in the way that places become yours, not by designation, but by repetition. They had sat on it in the August heat and the October cold and the particular clarity of November evenings when the air went sharp and the stars came close. They had talked about everything on it and said nothing on it, and occasionally sat in the specific silence of 2 people who don't need to talk to be together, which was, she thought, the rarest of the things she'd found. Summer settled into the ranch and the work of it continued. The work that never finished on a place this size, that simply moved from one form to another. The cooperative grain arrangement had become established enough that the 3 ranches were talking about expanding it to include a 4th, and Eliza had been included in those conversations as the person who had initiated it, which was new and which she was finding that she liked. The 4 pages she'd written at the kitchen table in November had become part of how the ranch operated. She did not call attention to this. Nathan did, occasionally, when he mentioned things to the other ranchers. He said Eliza had identified it, or Eliza's work on the supply accounts had shown. She had noticed and had said nothing about it and had felt something. A woman she had known slightly in Caldwell Creek, Ruth Calloway's neighbor, a Mrs. Price, had sent a letter in the spring. A cautious letter. A letter with an apology in it for the auction, for not doing anything, for the specific cowardice of standing in the square and letting it happen. Eliza had read it twice and then sat with it for several days before writing back. Her response was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. She wrote that she understood the circumstances of the time and that she hoped things were well with Mrs. Price's family, and she left the door open without swinging it wide, because an apology in a letter was a beginning of something, not a resolution of it, and she would see what followed. What followed, in the months after, was a tentative correspondence, letters about practical things, a recipe exchanged, news of the county. It was not friendship yet. It might become one. Eliza was willing to let it develop at its own pace, which she had discovered was the pace that produced things worth having. She did not return to Caldwell Creek for anything that wasn't necessary. The town held a particular gravity for her still. The square, the platform, the specific geography of the worst morning of her life. And she was not ready to move through it casually. Nathan never suggested she should. When he needed to go to town, he went. When she chose to go, she went. When she didn't choose to, she stayed at the ranch, and that was simply the arrangement. One afternoon in August, Chet asked her if she could come to the barn. This was unusual. Chet came to find her when there was something that required finding her, but he was not in the habit of making requests, and the phrasing, "Could you come?" was different from his normal declarative communication. She went. The bay mare was in the inner stall. She was not sick. Her posture was easy, her eyes clear. She was standing with her head turned toward the door in that listening way horses have. Benjamin was in the stall with her. He was not riding, just standing beside her with his hand flat on her neck, the way he'd done since Chet first let him in. He was talking to her. She couldn't make out the words. Chet was standing at the stall door, watching. "What am I looking at?" Eliza said quietly. "He comes here every afternoon," Chet said. "Has since January." "I know." "He talks to her," Chet said. "Different things. Things that are on his mind, I think. He doesn't know I can hear." Eliza looked at her son. "He told her," Chet said, "about his father, 2 weeks ago. He talked for a while." She stood very still. "He's not replacing anything," Chet said. He said this plainly, not gently, because Chet's plainness was his form of care. He needed somewhere to put it." She looked at Benjamin's back, his small hand against the horse's neck. She thought about a 5-year-old following Chet around the ranch 2 months after the worst thing had happened to him, and a stone from the water trough, and a mare that let him in the stall when she let most adults out, and 12 months of a boy learning where to put things. She thought about her son carrying the loss of his father in the particular silent way that young children carry things they don't have words for yet, and finding a place for it in the quiet of a barn in the afternoons, and the horse receiving it without judgment. Some things don't need fixing. Some things need witnessing. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Chet nodded and walked away. She stayed at the barn door for another minute, and then she walked back to the house. She sat at the kitchen table and she was quiet for a while in a way that was not sad exactly, though it had sadness in it. It had love in it too, the particular love that is made out of watching someone you are responsible for find their own way through something, which is different from the love of holding them through it, and is, in its own way, harder. She had not been able to protect her children from loss. She had not been able to keep their father from dying, or from the debts he'd hidden, or from the way the world had treated them in the weeks after. She had not been able to keep them off the auction platform, or out of the crowd's flat gaze, or away from the specific damage of being witnessed in their lowest moment. What she had done was, she had not let go of their hands. She had stood between them and every threat that had a door she could stand in front of. She had built a home where they had room to become who they were going to be, and she had not required them to be uncomplicated in their becoming, had not asked them to put down the weight of what they'd carried before they were ready. That was not everything. But it was not nothing. It was, she thought, what she'd had available to give, and she had given it without reservation, and the result was a boy in a barn talking to a horse about his father, and a girl with a notebook full of things worth remembering, and the specific unbothered wholeness of 2 children who had been through a great deal and were not broken. She was not the woman who had stood on the auction platform. Or she was. But the platform was not the end of the story, and the story had gone to places she hadn't been able to see from there. She had been sold in a public square by a man who believed that people were things that could be owned, and she had arrived at the other end of it with a clearer understanding of what she was worth than she'd had at the beginning. Not the dollar amount, not what the market of a frontier town assigned to a widow and her children, but the other kind of worth, the kind that doesn't get set by someone else's bid. She had learned what she was capable of. She had learned it in a hallway with a shotgun, and in a kitchen writing letters at midnight, and in a barn doorway watching her son, and on a porch in 100 evenings learning the particular shape of the person beside her. It was not a flattering or romantic kind of learning. It was just the truth accumulated over months about what she could carry and what she could do and what she refused to let go of. She heard Nathan come in from the range in the late afternoon, the particular sound of him, his boots, the way he moved through the back door. She heard him at the basin. She heard him check the coffee pot and find it full because she'd made it an hour ago. He came to the kitchen doorway, and she was at the table, and he looked at her with the attentiveness he had when something was on her face. "The mayor and Benjamin," she said. "Chet told me something." She told him what Chet had said. He listened, and she could see him understanding it, the full weight of it, what it meant that Benjamin had been doing this, what it said about what the boy was carrying and how he was carrying it. When she finished, Nathan sat down. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "Is he all right?" he said. "I think he is," she said. "I think he's more all right than I knew." Nathan was quiet. Then, "Should I say something to him?" She thought about it. "Not yet. Let him have it. When he's ready to bring it out of the barn, he'll bring it." He accepted this. He picked up the coffee she'd poured for him without being asked, because after a year she knew when he would want it. Outside, through the kitchen window, the light was moving the way late summer light moves on that land, long and angled and specific, throwing the shape of the corral fence across the dry grass in shadows that stretched east. She had come to love this light. It had taken months, and it was the particular kind of love that comes from looking at something daily until it is yours. She heard Benjamin come in from the barn, his feet, louder than Clara's, the screen door he never remembered not to let slam. And then Clara's voice from the main room asking him something, and his answer, and the particular sound of children who are home. She was not going to tell Benjamin she knew. She was going to let him have his afternoons in the barn, and his stone on the nightstand, and his mornings riding the mare, and his father in the place he'd found to put him, and she was going to watch him grow into a person who had been through something and had not been made smaller by it. The world had a way of teaching its hardest lessons without asking whether you were ready for them. Loss came when it came. Cruelty did not schedule itself. The ground dropped out on a Thursday, and you were in it before you had a theory about how to manage it. What you had, when the ground dropped out, was what you'd already built in yourself. The accumulated quiet work of daily honesty, of showing up for the people who needed you even when you were exhausted, of making decisions based on what was true rather than what was comfortable, of refusing to let other people's definitions of your worth become your own definition. She had not known she had that in her when she stood on the auction platform. She had known it was necessary. She had found, over the months that followed, that necessity and having it were not always different things. Nathan would not have called himself her rescuer, and she would not have called him that either. He had done what the moment required, and she had done what every subsequent moment required. And what they had built between them was not the result of rescue, but of two imperfect, specific people choosing the same direction for long enough that they arrived somewhere worth arriving. That was the truth of it, as best she could name it. Not a clean story, not a triumphal arc. A life, particular and ongoing, with work ahead and things unfinished, and her son's stone on his nightstand and her daughter's notebook in her pocket, and the kitchen light visible from the bend in the road. She got up and started supper. Benjamin came into the kitchen and asked if he could help, which was unusual, and she said yes and gave him something real to do, and he did it with the focused imprecision of a 6-year-old, and she watched his hands and did not say she knew. And the supper came together in the ordinary way, and Clara set the table without being asked, and Nathan came in from wherever he'd gone and sat in his chair, and outside the summer evening came down on the ranch the way it came down on this land, slow and specific and theirs. They ate together. The lamp was lit. The door was hers to open or close.